The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting gentle colors across empty wooden pews. Yet Sarah sat in the third row from the front, her shoulders curved inward like a protective shell around her breaking heart. She had come to this quiet sanctuary not because she felt particularly faithful, but because she felt particularly lost, carrying within her chest a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, each unanswered prayer, each moment of silence that stretched between her desperate whispers to heaven and what felt like an endless, echoing void. The psalmist David knew this feeling intimately when he cried out in Psalm 42:11, asking his own soul the question that resonates through centuries of human suffering. "Why, my soul, are you downcast? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God." These words, carved into the ancient text by a man who understood the geography of despair, speak directly to the landscape of every weary heart that has ever wondered if God truly sees, truly cares, truly listens to the prayers that feel like they dissolve into silence before they ever reach heaven's throne. Sarah's story is not unique in its pain, though it feels utterly singular in its intensity. For she had been carrying the burden of her daughter's illness for months now, watching a vibrant 12-year-old girl slowly fade into someone she barely recognized. And every prayer seemed to bounce off the ceiling of her bedroom. Every plea for healing met with another day of decline, another night of restless sleep interrupted by fever and fear. The doctors spoke in careful, measured tones about treatment options and statistical probabilities, but what they could not quantify was the way a mother's heart fractures when she realizes that all her love, all her fierce protection, all her willingness to trade places with her child means nothing in the face of cellular rebellion that refuses to be reasoned with or bargained away. She had bargained, of course, in those desperate 3 a.m. conversations with God, offering her own health, her own years, her own happiness in exchange for her daughter's recovery. But the silence that followed these desperate negotiations felt more profound than the absence of sound. It felt like the absence of hope itself. Yet here in this quiet church, surrounded by the accumulated prayers of generations who had sat in these same pews, carrying their own impossible burdens, Sarah began to understand something that would take months to fully comprehend. That God's listening is not measured by the speed of his response, and his love is not demonstrated by his willingness to rearrange the universe according to our desperate demands. The weight she carried was real, the exhaustion bone-deep and spirit-crushing. But in the silence that had felt so empty, there was actually a presence so gentle that it could only be perceived by a heart broken open enough to receive it. This is the paradox of spiritual suffering. That sometimes we must be emptied completely before we can be filled with something far greater than our own understanding, far more sustaining than our own strength, far more reliable than our own ability to control outcomes and engineer happiness through sheer force of will and fervent prayer. The morning she sat in that third pew, Sarah did not receive the miracle she had been demanding, did not hear an audible voice promising immediate healing, did not experience the dramatic intervention she had been visualizing in her most hopeful moments. Yet something did shift in the landscape of her soul. Perhaps it was the way the light moved across the wooden cross at the front of the sanctuary, or the distant sound of traffic that reminded her that life continued its rhythm even in the midst of her crisis, or simply the exhaustion that comes when we finally stop fighting against reality and allow ourselves to sink into the arms of something larger than our own capacity to understand or control. The psalmist's question, "Why, my soul, are you downcast?" is not really a question seeking information, but rather an invitation to acknowledge the depth of our pain while simultaneously remembering that our souls were created for something beyond the temporary circumstances that threaten to define our entire existence. When we feel spiritually exhausted, when our prayers feel like they disappear into an empty sky, when our faith feels more like obligation than joy, when the weight of unmet expectations presses down upon our chest until each breath requires conscious effort, we are not experiencing a failure of faith, but rather an invitation into a deeper relationship with the God who meets us not only in our victories and celebrations, but especially in our defeats and devastations. Sarah's daughter would face many more difficult days ahead, months of treatment that would test every assumption this family had ever held about fairness and divine intervention. Yet the mother who sat in that church pew began a journey that morning that would transform her understanding not only of prayer and healing, but of the very nature of God's presence in human suffering. The God who created us with hearts capable of such profound love also created us with souls strong enough to carry grief without being destroyed by it, deep enough to hold questions without demanding immediate answers, resilient enough to continue hoping even when hope feels like the most irrational response possible to our circumstances. This is where every journey toward spiritual renewal must begin, not with pretending that our burdens are lighter than they actually are, not with manufacturing artificial optimism in the face of legitimate despair, but with the honest acknowledgement that our souls are indeed heavy and that we are indeed in desperate need of something beyond our own, resources to sustain us through the valleys that seem to stretch endlessly before us. The invitation implicit in David's psalm is not to shame ourselves for feeling downcast, but to recognize that even our despair can become a form of prayer. Even our questions can become a pathway to deeper intimacy with the one who is not threatened by our doubt, not offended by our anger, not surprised by our exhaustion. The God who sees every sparrow that falls surely sees every tear that falls from eyes that have grown weary with watching for miracles that seem perpetually delayed, every sigh that escapes from lungs that feel too tired to continue drawing breath, every heart that beats with the stubborn persistence of hope, even when hope feels like the cruelest joke. The universe could play on creatures desperate enough to believe that love might actually triumph over loss. The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape so barren and unforgiving that it seemed designed specifically to strip away every pretense, every comfort, every illusion of self-sufficiency that the human heart uses to insulate itself from its own desperate need for divine intervention. Elijah sat beneath a solitary broom tree, its sparse shade offering minimal relief from the relentless sun. Yet the physical discomfort of his surroundings paled in comparison to the spiritual exhaustion that had driven him to this desolate place. Fleeing from Queen Jezebel's threats after his dramatic victory over the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, just days earlier he had witnessed fire fall from heaven, had seen an entire nation turn back to God, had experienced the kind of miraculous confirmation that most people spend their entire lives hoping to encounter. Yet here he sat in the wilderness, so overwhelmed by despair that he actually prayed for death, asking God to take his life because he felt utterly alone, utterly defeated, utterly convinced that his ministry had accomplished nothing of lasting significance. The irony of Elijah's wilderness experience speaks directly to the paradox of spiritual life that confounds believers across every generation, that our most profound encounters with despair often follow immediately on the heels of our most dramatic experiences of God's power, that the mountain peaks of faith seem to make the valleys of doubt feel even deeper and more treacherous, that the very victories we thought would sustain us indefinitely sometimes leave us feeling more vulnerable and isolated than we did before we experienced them. Elijah's journey into the wilderness represents more than one man's personal crisis of faith. It represents the universal human experience of discovering that external validation, even miraculous external validation, cannot heal the internal wounds that drive us to seek God in the first place, cannot silence the internal voices that whisper accusations about our worthiness, our effectiveness, our ultimate significance in the grand scheme of divine purposes that often seem to unfold with frustrating slowness and bewildering complexity. In the wilderness, stripped of every external source of validation and comfort, Elijah encountered something that would revolutionize not only his understanding of how God communicates, but his entire approach to recognizing divine presence in the midst of human suffering. 1 Kings 19:11-12 records that God instructed Elijah to stand on the mountain and wait for the Lord to pass by, and as he waited, a great and powerful wind tore through the mountains and shattered rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake that shook the very foundations of the mountain, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire that consumed everything in its path, But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper, a still small voice, a sound so subtle that it could only be heard by someone who had learned to listen with more than their ears, someone who had discovered that divine communication often arrives not through spectacular displays of power, but through the quiet movements of grace that can only be perceived by hearts that have been broken open enough to receive them. This encounter between Elijah and the gentle whisper of God speaks to every soul who has ever felt abandoned in their own wilderness seasons, every heart that has wondered why God seems so silent in the midst of their deepest struggles, every person who has concluded that divine absence must be the explanation for the apparent lack of dramatic intervention in their circumstances. The wind, earthquake, and fire that preceded God's whisper were not random natural phenomena, but deliberate demonstrations of the kinds of dramatic displays that the human heart often expects. From divine encounters, we want our prayers answered with earthquakes that shake our problems loose from their stubborn grip on our lives. We want our needs met through fires that consume every obstacle standing between us and our desired outcomes. We want our circumstances changed through winds so powerful that they rearrange the entire landscape of our situation, according to our specifications and timeline, yet God chose to reveal himself to Elijah not through these spectacular displays, but through a whisper, so gentle that it required the prophet to cover his face with his cloak and step out of his cave to hear it properly. So subtle that it could have been easily missed by someone who had not learned to recognize divine presence in forms that defy human expectations about how power should manifest itself in the world. The Hebrew phrase traditionally translated as still small voice literally means a sound of gentle stillness, or the voice of gentle silence, suggesting that God's communication with his people often arrives not as interruption to their solitude, but as the very essence of solitude itself, not as rescue from their wilderness, but as the sacred presence that transforms wilderness from a place of abandonment into a sanctuary of intimate communion with the divine. This transformation of understanding, from expecting God to meet us through dramatic rescue to learning to recognize his presence in the gentle movements of grace that surround us even in our most desolate moments, represents one of the most crucial shifts in spiritual maturity. The difference between a faith that depends on constant external validation and a faith that has learned to find sustenance in the quiet, assurance of divine love that whispers beneath the surface of our conscious awareness, even when our circumstances seem to contradict everything we thought we knew about God's character and intentions. Elijah's wilderness encounter teaches us that solitude, rather than being evidence of divine abandonment, can actually become the very condition necessary for hearing the voice of God with clarity and depth that would be impossible in the midst of life's ordinary noise and distraction. The prophet who emerged from his wilderness experience was not the same man who had fled there in despair and exhaustion. He had encountered a God who meets his people not only in their victories, but especially in their defeats, not only in their strength, but especially in their weakness, not only in their certainty, but especially in their confusion and doubt. This God who speaks in whispers rather than shouts, who reveals himself in stillness rather than storm, who offers presence rather than mere answers, transforms every wilderness season from a place of exile into a place of encounter, every moment of isolation into an opportunity for intimacy, every experience of spiritual dryness into preparation for deeper wells of living water that can only be discovered by those who have learned to listen with the ears of their heart rather than demanding that God conform to their expectations about how divine communication should sound. The traveler had been walking for what felt like an eternity, his weathered boots marking a rhythm against the dusty path that stretched endlessly before him, each step requiring more effort than the last as the heavy pack on his shoulders seemed to grow heavier with every mile, filled not only with the practical necessities of his journey, but with the accumulated weight of responsibilities, expectations, failures, and fears that every human heart carries through the landscape of ordinary life. The straps of his pack had worn grooves into his shoulders, and the constant pressure had created a dull ache that radiated through his entire upper body. Yet he continued walking because stopping seemed more frightening than continuing, because rest felt like a luxury he could not afford. because somewhere along the way he had internalized the lie that his worth was measured by his productivity, his value determined by his ability to keep moving forward regardless of the cost to his physical, emotional, or spiritual well-being. As the afternoon sun reached its peak intensity, transforming the air into shimmering waves of heat that made the horizon dance with mirages of relief that always seemed to retreat just as they came within reach, the traveler crested a small hill and saw below him something that initially seemed too good to be true. A river flowing clear and cool through a grove of ancient trees, whose branches created a canopy of shade so inviting that he could almost feel the relief before he experienced it, could almost taste the cool water before it touched his lips, could almost sense the peace that might be possible if he allowed himself to believe that rest was not only permissible, but essential, not only available but desperately needed. Not only offered, but offered specifically to him in this moment of absolute exhaustion and need. This scene of rest, beside flowing water, echoes the invitation that Jesus extended in Matthew 11:28-30 when he spoke words that have provided comfort to weary souls across 2 millennia. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." These words, spoken by the one who understood both the divine perspective on human suffering and the human experience of carrying burdens that feel too heavy to bear, represent more than a simple invitation to physical rest. They represent a fundamental redefinition of what it means to live as human beings created in the image of God, designed not for endless striving and performance-based worth, but for intimate relationship with the one who offers to share our load, to teach us a different way of moving through the world, to replace our frantic efforts to prove our value with the gentle rhythm of grace received and grace extended. The traveler who approaches this river represents every person who has ever felt crushed beneath the weight of expectations, both their own and those placed upon them by others. Every soul who has discovered that the pack they have been carrying contains not only legitimate responsibilities but also shame, guilt, perfectionism, and the exhausting burden of trying to earn love through achievement, trying to secure approval through performance, trying to guarantee safety through control of outcomes that were never meant to be within human power to control. The moment when this traveler allows his pack to slide from his shoulders and hit the ground with a thud that echoes through the grove represents more than physical relief. It represents the spiritual act of surrender that makes divine rest possible, the recognition that our attempts to carry everything ourselves have not made us stronger, but have actually separated us from the source of true strength, true peace, true restoration. As the traveler kneels beside the flowing water and cups it in his hands, the prayer that Hannah eventually spoke aloud in 1 Samuel 2:1-10 after Samuel's birth reveals that her years of silent weeping had been slowly cultivating a theological depth and spiritual maturity that might never have developed if her prayers had been answered according to her original timeline and specifications. Her song of praise demonstrates an understanding of God's character that could only have been forged in the furnace of delayed gratification, a trust in divine wisdom that could only have emerged from seasons of not understanding why her deepest longings remained unfulfilled despite her faithful devotion and consistent prayer. A joy that was made more precious by its contrast with the sorrow that had preceded it, and more meaningful because it had been purchased with tears that had taught her to treasure God's gifts without taking them for granted. The legitimacy of tearful prayer extends beyond individual circumstances to encompass every form of human grief and longing. Tears shed over broken relationships that cannot be repaired through human effort alone. Tears of frustration over injustices that seem to prevail despite our prayers for righteousness and justice. Tears of exhaustion from carrying burdens that feel too heavy for human shoulders. Tears of confusion when God's ways seem to contradict our understanding of divine love and care. Tears of disappointment when our timeline for answered prayer extends far beyond our capacity for patient waiting. Each of these tears, like Hannah's, carries the potential to become a form of prayer that moves the heart, Of God, not because tears manipulate divine emotion, but because tears represent the kind of authentic vulnerability that creates space for divine intervention, the kind of honest need that allows grace to flow unobstructed by pride and self-sufficiency. The God who treasures every tear in his bottle, as the psalmist declares in Psalm 56:8, is not a God who is distant from human emotion, but one who enters so fully into our experience that our grief becomes his grief, our longing becomes his longing. Our tears become the very prayers that he uses to accomplish his purposes, in ways that far exceed our original petitions and transform our individual pain into corporate blessing that touches lives we never imagined. Our tears could reach the storm approached with the kind of ominous certainty that sends every living creature scrambling for shelter, dark clouds rolling across the horizon like an advancing army, lightning fracturing the sky with brilliant veins of electricity that illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary clarity before plunging it back into premature darkness. Wind beginning to whistle through the trees with increasing intensity, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of destruction for anything caught unprepared in its path. High in the branches of an ancient oak tree, a mother bird sensed the approaching danger with instincts honed by generations of survival, her small heart beating rapidly as she assessed the threat to her nest, her eyes scanning the darkening sky with the kind of fierce protectiveness that only mothers understand, her wings already beginning to spread in preparation for the battle she would wage against the elements to keep her vulnerable, offspring safe from the chaos that was about to be unleashed upon their small corner of the world. As the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy with the promise of the deluge to come, the mother bird settled over her nest with deliberate purpose, her wings extending to create a living canopy over the tiny bodies that chirped their distress beneath her, her own small frame becoming a barrier between her children and the fury of nature that would soon be unleashing its full power upon everything in its path. The storm that followed was everything that had been promised by the advancing clouds. Wind that bent trees nearly to breaking, rain that fell in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, thunder that shook the ground and rattled windows, lightning that split the darkness with the kind of raw power that reminds every living creature of its absolute vulnerability in the face of forces beyond human control or comprehension. Yet beneath the shelter of her wings, the baby birds experienced the storm as nothing more than distant noise, muffled chaos that could not reach them because of the protective presence of the one who had chosen to bear the full brunt of the tempest rather than allow it to touch those entrusted to her care. This image of divine protection, captured so beautifully in Psalm 91:4, where God promises that he will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge, speaks to something fundamental about the nature of divine love that often gets obscured by our human tendency to equate protection with the absence of difficult circumstances rather than understanding protection as the presence of divine shelter within difficult circumstances. The mother bird's wings did not prevent the storm from coming, did not alter the wind patterns or redirect the lightning or diminish the intensity of the rain. Yet they provided something far more precious than meteorological control. They provided the assurance of presence, the comfort of not facing the storm alone, the security that comes from knowing that whatever chaos might be raging in the external world, there exists a space of safety where love is stronger than fear, where protection is not the absence of danger, but the promise that danger will not have the final word. Too often in our human experience of suffering and uncertainty, we make the mistake of interpreting the presence of storms as evidence of divine absence, concluding that if God really loved us, if God really cared about our well-being, if God really had the power to intervene in human affairs, then surely he would prevent the difficulties that threaten to overwhelm us rather than allowing us to experience them at all. This theological error, the assumption that divine love should manifest primarily through the elimination of challenges rather than through presence within challenges, causes us to miss the deeper reality of divine protection that operates not by controlling external circumstances but by providing internal resources, not by shielding us from every possible hardship, but by ensuring that no hardship can ultimately separate us from the love that forms the foundation of our existence. No storm can rage with such intensity that it drowns out the voice that speaks peace to our souls. No darkness can be so complete that it extinguishes the light that shines within us through divine presence. The wings that cover us in times of storm are not physical appendages that we can see with our eyes or touch with our hands, yet they are no less real than the mother bird's wings that sheltered her offspring from the chaos that surrounded their nest. They are the wings of divine faithfulness that have been spread over the human race from the moment of creation. The wings of covenant love that promise never to leave us or forsake us regardless of how turbulent our circumstances become. The wings of grace that provide shelter not from difficulty but within difficulty. Not from the experience of vulnerability, but within the experience of vulnerability. Not from the reality of living in a world where storms are inevitable, but within that reality with the assurance that no storm lasts forever and no storm is more powerful than the love that holds us when everything else seems to be falling apart. The protection offered by divine wings does not eliminate pain but transforms our relationship with pain. Does not prevent loss but changes our understanding of what cannot be lost. Does not guarantee that external circumstances will conform to our preferences but ensures that our deepest identity remains secure regardless of how much external circumstances may change or threaten or disappoint us. Under His wings, we discover that we are more than our circumstances, more resilient than we imagined, more deeply loved than our fears had convinced us was possible, more securely held than the chaos around us would suggest. This is protection that operates at the level of the soul rather than merely at the level of circumstances. Refuge that shelters our core identity even when our external security feels completely undermined. Safety that is rooted not in the absence of threat, but in the presence of love that is stronger than any threat. The baby birds under their mothers' wings did not understand the meteorological forces that created the storm, did not comprehend the physics of wind and rain and electrical discharge, did not have the cognitive capacity to appreciate the sacrifice their mother was making by absorbing the full impact of the tempest rather than seeking her own shelter elsewhere. Yet they experienced perfect peace in the midst of perfect chaos because they trusted the wings that covered them, because they had learned through consistent experience that those wings represented safety, because their small hearts knew at some instinctual level that the presence of their protector was more reliable than the absence of external threats. This is the kind of trust that spiritual maturity cultivates. Not trust that God will eliminate every storm from our path, but trust that God's wings will provide shelter within every storm. Not faith that difficult circumstances prove divine abandonment, but faith that divine presence transforms difficult circumstances from evidence of cosmic indifference into opportunities for deeper intimacy with the one whose love is demonstrated not by His willingness to rearrange the universe according to our preferences, but by His commitment to remain present with us, while the universe runs its course according to laws and patterns that serve purposes larger than our individual comfort and understanding. Darkness had settled over the hillside like a heavy blanket, the kind of complete blackness that comes when clouds obscure even the faintest starlight, transforming familiar paths into treacherous terrain and reducing the world to the few feet directly in front of one's uncertain steps. Yet somewhere in this disorienting maze of shadows and silence, a single sheep wandered with growing panic, her small hooves stumbling over rocks and roots that she could not see, her bleating calls echoing off unseen cliffs and returning to her as hollow reminders of how thoroughly lost she had become. Hours earlier, she had been grazing peacefully with the rest of the flock, the shepherd's presence a constant source of security that she had taken for granted, the familiar voices of her companions a comforting soundtrack to the ordinary rhythms of pasture life. Yet a moment of inattention, a tempting patch of grass just beyond the designated boundaries. A series of small choices that seemed harmless at the time had led her step by step away from safety, into this nightmare of isolation where every sound seemed threatening and every shadow suggested danger lurking just beyond her limited range of vision. The sheep's journey into lostness mirrors the human experience of spiritual disorientation more closely than we often care to admit. For most of us do not begin our days with the intention of wandering away from God. Do not make conscious decisions to abandon the spiritual disciplines and relationships that have provided stability and direction. Do not set out deliberately to create distance between ourselves and the divine presence that has been our source of comfort and guidance through previous seasons of uncertainty and challenge. Instead, like the lost sheep, we find ourselves in darkness through a series of small compromises. Incremental choices that seemed insignificant at the time. Moments of inattention to the voice of wisdom that had been guiding us safely through the landscape of our lives. Gradual movements toward what appeared to be greener grass that led us further and further from the fold until we suddenly realized that we could no longer hear the familiar sounds of home, could no longer see the landmarks that had helped us navigate, could no longer sense the protective presence that had made even the valleys feel safe. Yet in the darkness of the hillside, while the lost sheep bleated her distress into what seemed like an empty void, another voice was already calling through the night. A voice so familiar that even her panic could not prevent her from recognizing it. So patient that it continued calling even when her own fear made it difficult for her to respond. So persistent that it reached her ears despite the wind and the distance and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that had convinced her she was beyond rescue. The shepherd had noticed her absence the moment she had strayed from the flock, had watched with concern as she moved further from safety, had immediately begun the search that would continue through the night if necessary, not because she was the most valuable sheep in his flock or because she had earned his special attention through particularly good behavior, but simply because she belonged to him, because her name was written in his heart, because his identity as a shepherd was inseparable from his commitment, to ensure that not one of those entrusted to his care would be left to face the darkness alone. This scene of nocturnal rescue embodies the truth that Jesus proclaimed in John 10:14 when he declared, "I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me." Words that speak to a relationship far more intimate and personal than the generic care that might be expected from someone merely performing professional duties. The knowledge that Jesus speaks of here is not the abstract awareness that a shepherd might have of his flock's general location and approximate number, but the intimate familiarity that comes from daily interaction, consistent presence, and deep investment in the welfare of each individual creature under his protection. This is knowledge that includes not only the sheep's physical characteristics and behavioral patterns, but her particular vulnerabilities, her unique personality, her specific needs, her individual history of faithful following and occasional wandering, her personal responses to different forms of guidance and correction and encouragement. When the shepherd called the lost sheep's name through the darkness, he was not conducting a generic search and rescue operation but seeking one specific member of his flock whose absence had left a hole in the community that could not be filled by the presence of all the others who had remained safely within the boundaries he had established for their protection. The name he called was not a designation but a relationship, not a label but a bond, not an identification number but an expression of connection that had been forged through countless days of shared experience, mutual trust, and consistent care that had created between shepherd and sheep the kind of intimate knowledge that makes separation impossible to ignore and reunion an absolute priority regardless of the cost in time, energy, and personal risk. The darkness that surrounded the lost sheep, threatening and disorienting as it was, could not prevent the shepherd's voice from reaching her, could not distort the sound of her name spoken with love and concern, could not block the communication that had been established through relationship rather than mere proximity, through covenant rather than convenience, through commitment that transcends circumstances rather than sentiment that depends on ideal conditions. This is the mystery of divine love that defies human logic, that no distance is too great for the good shepherd's voice to travel. No darkness is too complete for his call to penetrate. No wilderness is too vast for his search to cover. No failure is too shameful for his forgiveness to encompass. No wandering is too far for his grace to reach. The sheep who heard her name called through the darkness experienced something that transforms every lost soul, who has ever felt abandoned by their own poor choices. The realization that being lost does not mean being forgotten, that making mistakes does not result in being written off, that wandering away from safety does not forfeit the right to be rescued, that the shepherd's commitment to each member of his flock is not conditional upon their perfect compliance with his guidance, but is rooted in his character as one who seeks and saves that which was lost. The voice that called her name through the night was the same voice that had guided her to green pastures and still waters in seasons of peace and plenty. The same voice that had warned her away from dangers she had been too inexperienced to recognize. The same voice that had comforted her during storms and celebrated with her during seasons of abundance. As dawn began to break over the hillside where the rescue had taken place, the sheep who had spent the night in terrifying isolation found herself once again surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds and scents of the flock. Yet she was not quite the same sheep who had wandered away the previous day. She had learned something about the shepherd's heart that she could never have understood while she remained safely within the boundaries of his protection, had experienced a dimension of his love that only becomes visible in the context of rescue, had discovered that her relationship with him was not based on her ability to avoid making mistakes but on his commitment to seek her out when mistakes inevitably led her into danger and darkness and despair. The dusty road stretched endlessly before them, each step carrying the two travelers further from Jerusalem and deeper into a landscape that seemed to mirror the desolation in their hearts. For they walked not merely as men returning home after a festival, but as disciples whose entire understanding of divine purpose had been shattered 3 days earlier when the one they had believed to be the Messiah died the death of a common criminal, abandoned by his followers, mocked by his enemies, apparently forsaken even by the God whose kingdom he had proclaimed with such authority and conviction. Cleopas walked beside his unnamed companion in the kind of stunned silence that follows devastating disappointment, the kind of grief that comes not merely from losing someone beloved, but from discovering that everything you thought you understood about God's plan for redemption was apparently built on false assumptions, misplaced hope, naive expectations that the world would bend to accommodate your theological certainties rather than forcing you to reconstruct your entire framework for understanding divine action in human history. Their conversation, when it finally began, was the kind of painful processing that happens when life refuses to conform to our carefully constructed expectations about how God should operate in the world, when circumstances seem to provide evidence that contradicts everything we thought we knew about divine love and power and faithfulness, when the very foundations of our faith feel shaken by events that appear to demonstrate either divine impotence or divine indifference to human suffering and confusion. Luke 24:13-35 records their journey to Emmaus as more than a simple travel narrative. It represents the universal human experience of trying to make sense of suffering that seems meaningless, disappointment that feels like divine betrayal, hope that has been deferred so long that it begins to feel like cruelty rather than kindness, promises that seem to have been broken by the very one who made them with such apparent sincerity and conviction. As they walked and talked, processing their confusion and grief with the kind of honest vulnerability that only comes when we have been stripped of our pretenses and forced to acknowledge that our understanding of God's ways is far more limited than we had previously been willing to admit. They became aware of another traveler who had fallen into step beside them, someone whose presence felt familiar, though they could not immediately identify him, someone who listened to their conversation with the kind of patient attention that invited them to continue sharing their burden rather than feeling the need to hide their disappointment behind religious platitudes or manufactured optimism. This stranger did not interrupt their processing with quick answers or easy explanations, did not minimize their pain by pointing out silver linings they were not yet ready to see, did not shame them for their questions or doubts or confusion, but instead created space for their honest expression of how God's apparent silence felt like abandonment, how divine inaction felt like evidence that their faith had been misplaced, how the death of their hope felt like the death of their identity. As people who had staked everything on the belief that God was actively working in history to establish justice and peace and healing, What these travelers could not yet recognize was that their companion on the road was the very one whose death had plunged them into despair, that the hope they were mourning as lost was walking beside them in a form they did not yet have eyes. To see that the divine presence they felt had abandoned them was actually more intimately present than it had ever been during the months when they had followed him through the countryside, listening to his teachings and witnessing his miracles. This is perhaps the most profound truth embedded in the Emmaus Road narrative. That God's presence in our lives is not always recognizable in the forms we expect. That divine companionship often comes disguised as ordinary human encounter. That the very seasons when we feel most abandoned by heaven may actually be the seasons when divine love is walking most closely beside us, patient enough to match our pace, gentle enough to listen to our complaints without defensiveness, wise enough to know that recognition and understanding will come in their proper time rather than being forced according to our timeline for spiritual clarity. The moment of recognition that transformed the disciples' journey from a retreat in defeat to a return in victory came not through dramatic revelation or supernatural manifestation, but through the simple, familiar act of breaking bread, the same gesture they had witnessed countless times during their months of following Jesus, yet now performed in a context that suddenly illuminated everything they had experienced, everything they had failed to understand, everything they had thought they had lost forever. Luke records that their eyes were opened and they knew him at the precise moment when he broke the bread, suggesting that divine recognition often comes not through extraordinary circumstances, but through ordinary moments that suddenly become transparent to spiritual reality, not through spectacular displays of power, but through gentle reminders of consistent love, not through answers to all our questions, but through the realization that our questions were being held by someone who had never actually left us alone with them. The transformation that occurred in that moment of recognition was so complete and so energizing that these two disciples, who had been walking away from Jerusalem in defeat and discouragement, immediately turned around and walked back through the night to share with the other disciples the good news that their grief had been premature, their hope had not been misplaced, their faith had not been foolish, their understanding had simply been incomplete rather than incorrect. The hope they had thought was buried with Jesus in a borrowed tomb was revealed to be more alive than ever, not despite the crucifixion, but because of what the crucifixion had accomplished, not in contradiction to divine love, but as the ultimate expression of divine love, not as evidence that God had abandoned his promises, but as proof that God's promises were being fulfilled in ways that exceeded human imagination and defied human expectations about how salvation should look. The Emmaus Road experience speaks directly to every season of spiritual life when hope feels distant, when God's promises seem empty, when circumstances appear to contradict everything we thought we knew about divine character and intention, when our prayers seem to bounce off a ceiling that has suddenly become impermeable to human need and divine response. In these seasons, the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus reminds us that divine presence is not always immediately recognizable, that God's companionship often comes in forms that initially seem ordinary rather than supernatural, that the hope we think we have lost may actually be walking beside us, waiting for our eyes to be open to perceive what has been there all along, waiting for our hearts to be prepared to receive what we had been seeking in the wrong places and expecting in the wrong forms. The bread that opened the disciples' eyes to Christ's presence was not magical bread, but familiar bread, not extraordinary in its substance, but transformative in its context, not different from countless other meals they had shared, but suddenly transparent to the spiritual reality that had been present all along, hidden not because God desired to remain concealed, but because their grief had temporarily blinded them to the presence they needed most, desperately to perceive and experience and trust. 12 years of bleeding had drained more than blood from her body. It had slowly leached away her hope, her social connections, her financial resources, her sense of dignity. and her belief that her situation could ever improve, leaving her not merely physically weak, but spiritually depleted, emotionally isolated, and financially devastated after spending everything she had on physicians who had not only failed to cure her condition, but had actually made it worse through treatments that added suffering without providing even the faintest glimmer of improvement. The woman who pressed through the crowd toward Jesus carried with her not only the physical burden of an ailment that had made her ceremonially unclean for over a decade, cutting her off from temple worship and community participation, but also the psychological weight of being considered cursed by God, avoided by neighbors, and reduced to a medical curiosity rather than being seen as a human being created in the divine image and deserving of compassion, respect, and the kind of healing that goes far deeper than physical restoration. Mark 5:25-34 records her story with a tenderness that captures both the desperation that drove her to violate social conventions by entering a crowd where her presence would make others unclean according to religious law, and the quiet faith that convinced her that even the briefest contact with Jesus would be sufficient to accomplish what 12 years of conventional medical treatment had failed to achieve. Her plan was simple and born of necessity. She would approach him from behind, touch the edge of his garment without calling attention to herself, receive her healing quietly, and disappear back into the crowd before anyone noticed her. Transgression of the social and religious boundaries that had been keeping her isolated for so many years that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed rather than avoided, embraced rather than shunned, seen as a person rather than dismissed as a problem. The moment her fingers made contact with the hem of Jesus's cloak, she felt immediately that something had changed in her body, that the constant drain of blood had stopped, that the weakness that had been her constant companion for 12 years had been replaced by a strength and vitality that she had not experienced since she was a young woman, that whatever had been broken in her physical system had been instantly restored to proper function in ways that defied medical explanation and exceeded her most optimistic hopes for what might be possible through contact with this teacher and healer whose reputation had reached even those who lived on the margins of society. Yet the physical healing, remarkable as it was, represented only the beginning of what Jesus intended to accomplish in her life, for when he stopped and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" he was not seeking information, but creating an opportunity for public restoration that would address not only her physical need but her social isolation, her spiritual shame, and her sense of being forgotten by God and abandoned by community. The disciples' response to Jesus' question reveals how little they understood about the difference between casual contact and faith-filled encounter, for they pointed out the obvious fact that many people in the pressing crowd were touching him, unable to comprehend that he was not asking about physical contact, but about the kind of desperate faith that had reached out to him with expectation, hope, and trust that went far beyond mere human interaction to become an encounter with divine power and compassion. The woman who had hoped to receive her healing anonymously found herself face to face with the source of her restoration, trembling not with fear but with awe as she realized that she had not stolen healing from an unsuspecting healer but had received a gift that was freely offered to anyone with enough faith to reach out and receive it. When she fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth about her condition, her desperation, her hope, and her immediate healing, she experienced something that was perhaps even more transformative than the physical restoration she had received. She experienced being seen, truly seen, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be avoided, but as a beloved child of God whose suffering had mattered to heaven, whose faith had been noticed and honored, whose need had been met not merely with clinical efficiency, but with personal attention that acknowledged her dignity, celebrated her courage, and restored her not only to physical health, but to community belonging and spiritual wholeness. Jesus' response to her confession was not rebuke for her presumption in touching him without permission, not concern about the ceremonial uncleanness she had transmitted to him, not embarrassment at the public revelation of intimate medical details, but celebration of faith that had reached beyond human limitation to grasp divine provision. "Daughter," he called her, a term of endearment that immediately established relationship, belonging, and value, transforming her in that moment from an anonymous sufferer on the margins of society to a beloved member of God's family whose faith had made her well, whose courage had been rewarded, whose desperate reach toward divine compassion had resulted in healing that encompassed far more than physical restoration. The word daughter spoken by Jesus carried with it all the implications of inheritance, protection, love, and permanent belonging that she had been denied during 12 years of social isolation, suggesting that her healing was not merely a one-time miracle, but an initiation into ongoing relationship with the one who saw her not as damaged goods, but as precious treasure, not as a burden, but as beloved, not as cursed, but as blessed with faith that had moved the heart of God and demonstrated the kind of trust that makes miraculous intervention not only possible, but inevitable. The healing that flowed through Jesus's garment was not magic, but love made manifest. Not impersonal power, but personal compassion. Not generic restoration, but specific attention to her particular need, her unique suffering, her individual faith that had distinguished her touch from all the other contact he experienced in the pressing crowd. This healing demonstrated that divine compassion operates not according to religious protocol or social hierarchy, but according to the heart's genuine reach toward God, not based on worthiness or ceremonial cleanliness, but on faith that believes healing is possible even when all human resources have been exhausted, even when medical professionals have given up, even when society has written off the sufferer as beyond hope or help. The woman who walked away from that encounter was not the same person who had approached Jesus with trembling fingers and desperate hope. She had experienced not only physical healing, but spiritual restoration, not only medical cure, but social rehabilitation, not only bodily wholeness, but emotional healing that came from being seen, acknowledged, valued, and blessed by the one whose touch had the power to restore not only broken bodies, but broken lives, broken dreams, broken relationships with God and community that had suffered along with her physical condition. Her healing became a testimony not only to divine power, but to divine love that sees every form of suffering, responds to every genuine cry for help, and provides restoration that addresses the whole person rather than merely treating symptoms. Healing that encompasses body and soul and spirit and social standing and future hope and present. Joy and eternal relationship with the God who delights in making all things new. The hem of Jesus' garment that she touched represented the accessible edge of divine compassion, the place where human desperation and divine love intersect. The point of contact where faith meets grace and miracles become not only possible but inevitable, where broken lives encounter the healing power that flows from the heart of God to address every form of human need with tenderness, wisdom, and perfect love that restores far more than we dare to ask and accomplishes far more than we have capacity to imagine or deserve to receive. The shepherd's staff tapped gently against the rocky path as he led his flock down from the hillside pastures toward the valley below, where a stream wound its way through groves of trees whose branches had grown heavy with summer leaves, creating pools of shade beside waters so still and clear that they perfectly reflected the sky above, turning the earth into a mirror of heaven where the sheep could drink without fear of swift currents or hidden dangers, could rest without anxiety about predators or unstable ground, could simply be sheep rather than constantly vigilant creatures scanning the horizon for threats to their safety and well-being. The pace of this journey was unhurried, almost leisurely, dictated not by the shepherd's agenda or the demands of efficiency, but by the needs of the flock, by the understanding that true care sometimes requires slowing down rather than speeding up, sometimes demands rest rather than productivity, sometimes calls for stillness rather than constant movement toward the next destination or achievement or goal. This scene beside still waters captures the essence of Psalm 23:2-3, where David writes, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Words that speak to something deeper than physical refreshment, something more essential than temporary rest, something more transformative than momentary relief from the pressures and demands that characterize so much of human existence. The Hebrew word, translated as still in this passage, suggests not merely the absence of turbulence, but the presence of peace. Not just calm on the surface, but tranquility that runs deep. Not simply quiet, but the kind of profound stillness that allows the soul to settle, to breathe, to remember what it means to exist without striving, to be rather than constantly doing, to rest in divine presence rather than frantically pursuing divine approval through endless activity and achievement. The shepherd who leads his sheep to these still waters understands something about the nature of restoration that often escapes our performance-driven culture. That souls, like bodies, require periods of genuine rest in order to function properly. That spiritual health depends not only on active service and constant growth, but also on seasons of quiet replenishment. That the deepest forms of renewal often happen not when we are actively pursuing them, but when we allow ourselves to be led to places of peace, where restoration can occur naturally, organically, according to divine rhythm, rather than human timeline. The sheep who drink from these still waters do not have to work for their refreshment, do not have to earn their right to rest, do not have to prove their worthiness for the shepherd's care and attention. They simply receive what is freely offered, trust what is graciously provided, and allow the restoration to happen at the pace and in the manner that serves their deepest needs rather than their surface anxieties. Too often in our spiritual lives, we make the mistake of believing that soul rest is something we must manufacture through our own efforts, something we can achieve by finding the right techniques or following the correct formulas or maintaining sufficient discipline in our spiritual practices. Yet the psalmist's imagery suggests something far more passive and receptive. We are led to still waters rather than discovering them through our own searching. We are made to lie down in green pastures rather than earning our way into rest through perfect performance. We receive restoration as a gift rather than achieving it as a reward for spiritual maturity or moral excellence. This divine leading operates according to grace rather than merit, flows from God's character as a shepherd rather than from our worthiness as sheep, emerges from divine love rather than human achievement. The stillness of these waters speaks to more than their physical characteristics. It represents the kind of inner peace that can only come from knowing that we are held by love that is stronger than our fears, guided by wisdom that surpasses our understanding, sustained by grace that is not dependent on our ability to hold everything together through our own strength and determination. When the psalmist speaks of God leading him beside still waters, he is describing more than a geographical journey. He is testifying to a spiritual reality in which divine presence transforms even the most turbulent circumstances into opportunities for rest, even the most chaotic seasons into sanctuaries of peace, even the most overwhelming challenges into invitations. To discover the soul rest that comes from trusting the shepherd's heart and surrendering control of outcomes that were never meant to be within human power to manage or manipulate. The restoration that occurs beside these still waters is not merely the repair of what has been damaged, but the renewal of what has been depleted, not simply the fixing of what has been broken, but the replenishment of what has been emptied through the ordinary demands of living in a world that often feels more like a battlefield than a sanctuary, more like a test than a gift, more like a trial to be endured than a grace to be received. Soul restoration involves the recovery of wonder, the renewal of hope, the rehabilitation of trust that life is fundamentally good despite the presence of real suffering, the restoration of faith that we are loved despite the evidence that sometimes seems to suggest otherwise, the renewal of joy that comes not from external circumstances, but from internal connection to the source of all joy, all peace, all hope, all love. The sheep who are led to still waters do not arrive there because they have navigated perfectly or followed flawlessly or demonstrated exceptional spiritual maturity. They arrive there because they have a shepherd who knows where such waters can be found, who understands their need for restoration before they do, who makes provision for their deepest needs even when they are focused on their most immediate concerns, who leads them not according to their preferences but according to their genuine needs. not according to their timeline, but according to divine wisdom that sees beyond the present moment to the broader pattern of grace that is unfolding in their lives. The leading that brings souls to still waters is gentle but persistent, patient but purposeful, responsive to our needs but not controlled by our demands, motivated by love but not manipulated by our attempts to direct the process according to our own understanding of what restoration should look like or how quickly it should occur. When David declares that God restores his soul, he is testifying to something that goes beyond psychological therapy or emotional healing, though it certainly includes these dimensions of restoration. He is speaking of the renewal of his core identity as one who is loved, valued, known, and held by divine grace. The restoration of his fundamental trust in God's goodness, despite the presence of enemies and difficulties and uncertainties that threaten to undermine that trust. The renewal of his sense of purpose and meaning and hope that comes not from external validation, but from internal connection to the one who created him for relationship, for joy, for peace, for the kind of abundant life that can only be experienced when the soul is regularly led to still waters where restoration happens not through human effort, but through divine grace, not through earning, but through receiving, not through striving, but through resting in the love that surrounds us like still waters, reflecting heaven's peace in the depths of our being and reminding us that we are held by love that will never let us go. The room fell silent when Thomas spoke the words that had been weighing on his heart for days, words that felt dangerous to voice in the presence of his fellow disciples who seemed so certain, so joyful, so confident in their proclamation that they had seen the risen Lord. Yet Thomas could not bring himself to share their enthusiasm, could not simply accept their testimony without the kind of evidence that would satisfy his particular temperament, his questioning mind, his need for verification that went beyond secondhand reports and emotional testimonies to include the kind of tangible proof that would convince not only his heart, but his intellect. Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe, he declared with the kind of honest doubt that makes religious people uncomfortable, the kind of intellectual integrity that refuses to pretend certainty where none exists, the kind of authentic questioning that exposes the difference between genuine faith and manufactured confidence designed to impress others or conform to expectations about how believers are supposed to respond to miraculous claims. Thomas's demand for evidence has earned him the unfortunate nickname Doubting Thomas throughout church history, as if his questions represented some kind of spiritual failure, some lack of faith that distinguished him from his more believing companions, some weakness of character that made him less suitable for apostleship than those who were able to accept the resurrection reports without requiring personal verification. Yet this interpretation of Thomas's response misses something crucial about the nature of authentic faith, something important about the difference between blind credulity and informed trust, something significant about God's willingness to meet honest doubters exactly where they are, rather than demanding that they suppress their questions in order to be considered spiritually mature or acceptably faithful. John 20:24-29 records what happened 8 days later when Jesus appeared again to the disciples, this time with Thomas present. And rather than rebuking him for his doubt, rather than shaming him for his need for evidence, rather than excluding him from the group because of his intellectual honesty, Jesus offered him exactly what he had requested: the opportunity to examine the wounds, to touch the scars, to verify through his own senses that the one standing before him was indeed the same Jesus who had died on the cross, the same body that had been broken and buried, the same person who had promised to rise from the dead, but whose promise had seemed too good to be true, too wonderful to be trusted, too extraordinary to be accepted, without the kind of proof that would satisfy even the most skeptical observer. The beauty of Jesus' response to Thomas lies not only in his willingness to provide the requested evidence, but in his understanding that different people have different pathways to faith, different needs for verification, different ways of processing truth that do not fit neatly into standardized expectations about how spiritual conviction should develop or manifest itself in individual lives. Jesus did not treat Thomas's doubt as a character flaw to be corrected, but as a legitimate need to be met, not as evidence of spiritual immaturity, but as an opportunity to demonstrate that divine love is patient enough to work with human personalities as they actually are, rather than as they think they should be, gracious enough to provide whatever form of assurance is needed to bring honest seekers into genuine relationship with truth, wise enough to recognize that faith built on solid evidence is often more durable than faith based on emotional experience or social pressure. When Thomas examined the wounds and felt the reality of Christ's physical presence, his response was immediate and profound. "My Lord and my God," words that represent one of the most explicit declarations of Christ's divinity recorded in the New Testament, a confession of faith that emerged not despite his previous doubt, but because of it, not in contradiction to his questioning, but as the natural result of questions that had been honestly asked and satisfactorily answered. Thomas's declaration suggests that doubt, when it leads to genuine seeking rather than cynical dismissal, when it drives us toward truth rather than away from it, when it motivates investigation rather than resignation, can actually become a pathway to faith that is more robust, more personal, more deeply rooted than faith that has never been tested by serious questions or challenged by legitimate concerns. The faith that emerged from Thomas's encounter with the risen Christ was not the same kind of faith that his fellow disciples possessed. It was distinctively his own, shaped by his particular personality, formed through his specific needs, authenticated by his individual encounter with divine truth rather than borrowed from others' experiences or accepted on the basis of peer pressure or community expectation. This personalized faith, forged in the crucible of honest doubt and satisfied through direct encounter with Christ, became the foundation for a lifetime of apostolic ministry that would take Thomas to the far reaches of the known world, according to tradition, carrying the gospel to places where his intellectual rigor and evidential approach to faith would serve him well in confronting philosophical challenges and skeptical audiences who needed more than emotional appeals to convince them of Christian truth. Jesus' final words to Thomas: "Because you have seen me, you have believed." Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, are often interpreted as a mild rebuke of Thomas's need for evidence. Yet they can also be understood as an acknowledgement that different people come to faith through different pathways, that some are blessed with the ability to trust without extensive verification, while others require more substantial evidence before they can commit themselves fully to beliefs that will shape their entire understanding of reality, purpose, and meaning. The blessing pronounced on those who believe without seeing does not diminish the validity of faith that emerges from careful examination of evidence. Rather, it acknowledges that both pathways, intuitive trust and evidential verification, can lead to authentic relationship with God when pursued with genuine seeking, rather than merely intellectual curiosity or spiritual pride. The Church's need for both kinds of believers, those who trust readily and those who question thoroughly, becomes apparent when we consider the different challenges that Christian communities face in different cultural contexts and historical periods. The faith that springs from immediate trust provides warmth, enthusiasm, and emotional richness to Christian community, while the faith that emerges from careful examination provides intellectual rigor, apologetic strength, and rational foundation that can withstand sophisticated philosophical challenges and academic scrutiny. Thomas's contribution to the apostolic community was not diminished by his initial doubt, but was actually enhanced by it, for his questions led to answers that strengthened not only his own faith, but the faith of everyone who has ever struggled with similar concerns about the reality of resurrection, the trustworthiness of miraculous claims, and the rational defensibility of Christian conviction. The fragility that Thomas felt in his faith was not a weakness to be overcome, but a honesty to be honored. Not a problem to be solved, but a personality trait to be blessed and utilized for kingdom purposes. Not evidence of spiritual immaturity, but indication of intellectual integrity that would serve him well in contexts where gullible faith would be quickly exposed and dismissed, while carefully examined faith would provide solid foundation for effective ministry and authentic witness, High on the rocky coast where the ocean met the land in endless cycles of wave and withdrawal, an old lighthouse keeper climbed the spiral stairs each evening as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, carrying with him an oil lamp whose flame had been burning continuously for more years than anyone in the village could remember. Tended by his father before him and his grandfather before that, passed down through generations, of men who understood that their calling was not merely to maintain a building but to keep alive a light that served as beacon and guide and promise of safety for travelers navigating treacherous waters in darkness that could be deceptive, dangerous, and potentially deadly for those who tried to find their way, without reference points that remained constant regardless of weather conditions, seasonal changes, or the shifting moods of sea and sky that could transform familiar coastlines into alien landscapes where even experienced sailors could lose their bearings and find themselves in mortal peril. The lighthouse keeper's work was both simple and profound. Each evening he would clean the lamp's glass globe, trim the wick to ensure optimal burning, refill the oil reservoir that fed the flame, and light the beacon that would burn through the night, casting its beam across miles of dark water to reach ships whose crews might not even be aware of their need for guidance but who would nevertheless benefit from the faithful presence of light that penetrated darkness, cut through fog, and provided orientation in conditions that could otherwise prove disastrous for vessels attempting to navigate by guesses and assumptions rather than by reliable landmarks that remained fixed and trustworthy regardless of external circumstances. This nightly ritual was performed not only during calm weather when the work felt easy and the results seemed obviously valuable, but also during storms when climbing the stairs required courage. Maintaining the flame demanded persistence, and keeping the light burning felt like a battle against forces that seemed determined to extinguish every source of illumination and leave travelers completely at the mercy of chaotic elements that recognized no human need for guidance, safety, or hope. This image of faithful light-keeping speaks directly to the promise embedded in John 1:5, where the apostle declares that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Words that testify to something far more significant than the triumph of literal illumination over physical darkness. Words that speak to the ultimate victory of divine love over human despair, divine truth over human confusion, divine hope over human resignation, divine life over human death, divine presence over human isolation, divine grace over human failure. The light that shines in spiritual darkness is not merely informational, providing knowledge about divine truth, but transformational, actually changing the nature of reality for those who receive it, not merely revealing what exists, but creating new possibilities for those who have been stumbling through life without adequate guidance, direction, or hope that their circumstances can improve, or their struggles can lead to something better than endless repetition of the same cycles of disappointment and frustration. The darkness that John speaks of in his gospel represents more than the absence of physical light. It encompasses all forms of spiritual blindness, moral confusion, emotional despair, intellectual pride, and existential meaninglessness that characterize human existence apart from divine illumination. All the ways that people lose their way when they try to navigate life's complexities without reference to the one who created them for relationship, for purpose, for joy, for peace, for love that transcends the temporary circumstances that often seem to define the boundaries of what is possible or meaningful or worthwhile. This darkness is not passive, but active. Not merely the absence of good, but the presence of forces that actively work against truth, beauty, goodness, hope, love, and all the values that make human existence meaningful and worthwhile. Forces that seek to convince people that their lives have no ultimate significance, that their choices do not matter, that their suffering serves no purpose, that their dreams are futile, that their hopes are naive, that their faith is misplaced. Yet against this darkness, which can seem so overwhelming and persistent that it appears to be the dominant reality in human experience, the light of Christ shines with a consistency and power that cannot be overcome, diminished, or extinguished by any combination of circumstances, opposition, or apparent defeat. The Greek word that John uses for overcome can also be translated as comprehend or grasp, suggesting that darkness not only cannot defeat the light, but cannot even fully understand it, cannot completely grasp its nature, cannot adequately explain its presence, cannot successfully predict its behavior, cannot control its influence, cannot limit its reach, cannot prevent its impact on those who are willing to receive it rather than resist it, welcome it rather than fear it, follow it rather than insist on finding their own way through the complexities and challenges of human existence. The lighthouse keeper, who tends his beacon through storms and calm nights alike, embodies the calling of every person who has received the light of Christ to keep that light burning not only for their own benefit, but for the sake of others who may be navigating their own dark waters, struggling with their own confusion and despair, searching for their own sense of direction and purpose and meaning in circumstances that often seem designed to obscure rather than illuminate the path forward. This light-keeping is not always easy or obviously rewarded. It requires persistence during seasons when the value of the work is not immediately apparent, faithfulness during periods when storms seem to threaten the very survival of the beacon, commitment to maintain the flame even when those who benefit from it never acknowledge their debt to the keeper who sacrificed comfort and convenience to ensure that light remained available in their time of need. The light that never fades is not dependent on human effort to keep it burning, yet it does depend on human cooperation to make it visible to others who need guidance, direction, hope, and the assurance that they are not alone in their struggles, that their lives have meaning and purpose beyond their immediate circumstances, that their temporary difficulties do not represent the final word about their identity, their destiny, or their relationship with the God who created them for joy rather than sorrow, for peace rather than anxiety, for love rather than isolation, for hope rather than despair. The Christ who is the light of the world shines through human lives that have been transformed by his presence, illuminates human communities that have been shaped by his love, penetrates human darkness through human vessels who have learned to reflect rather than obstruct the divine illumination that is constantly available to anyone willing to receive it and share it with others who are still searching for the lighthouse beacon that will guide them safely home through whatever storms they may be facing in their own journey toward the peace and rest and joy that God intends for all his children. The promise that darkness cannot overcome the light is not merely theological theory, but practical reality that can be experienced by anyone willing to step toward the illumination rather than retreating further into the shadows. Anyone ready to believe that their current circumstances do not represent the full story of their lives, anyone prepared to trust that the light that created the universe is more than adequate to illuminate whatever confusion, despair, or uncertainty they may be experiencing in their personal journey toward the wholeness, healing, and hope that are available to all who seek them with sincere hearts and open minds. In the Garden of Gethsemane, under olive trees whose ancient branches had witnessed centuries of human sorrow and divine faithfulness, Jesus knelt on ground made sacred not by religious ceremony, but by the depth of anguish that pressed down upon him as he contemplated the hours ahead, the weight of human sin that he would bear, the separation from his Father that he would endure, the physical agony that awaited him, and the spiritual darkness that would envelop him as he became the sacrifice for sins he had never committed, carrying guilt he had never earned, experiencing death he had never deserved on behalf of people who had rejected his love, ignored his teachings, and would continue to struggle with the same selfishness and pride and rebellion that made his sacrifice necessary in the first place. The sweat that fell from his brow like drops of blood testified to the intensity of his internal battle, the magnitude of his struggle between human desire for self-preservation and divine commitment to human redemption, the profound cost of love that chooses to suffer on behalf of others rather than seeking its own comfort, safety, and well-being. Luke 22:42 records the prayer that emerged from this place of ultimate testing. Father, if it is your will, "Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours, be done." Words that reveal both the full humanity of Jesus in his honest acknowledgement of the horror he faced and the complete divinity of Jesus in his perfect submission to the Father's plan despite the personal cost. Words that demonstrate that surrender to divine will is not the absence of preference or desire, but the transcendence of personal preference in service of higher purpose, not the denial of human feelings, but the subordination of human feelings to divine wisdom, not passive resignation to unavoidable fate, but active choice to trust divine love, even when that love leads through valleys of suffering that seem to contradict everything we think we know about how love should protect those who are beloved. Surrender that Jesus modeled in Gethsemane represents the most profound form of spiritual strength available to human beings. The strength that comes not from controlling circumstances to conform to our preferences, but from trusting divine wisdom. When divine wisdom leads us through experiences we would never choose for ourselves. The strength that emerges not from getting our own way, but from discovering that God's way is ultimately better than our way, even when it initially appears to be more difficult, more painful, more costly than the alternatives we can imagine. This surrender is not weakness disguised as strength, but actual strength that can only be accessed by those who have learned to distinguish between what appears to be in their best interests and what actually serves their deepest needs, between what feels safe and what actually leads to genuine security, between what promises immediate relief and what produces lasting transformation. The image of a gardener releasing a seed into soil provides a powerful metaphor for understanding the spiritual dynamics of surrender, the seed that is held tightly in the gardener's hand. Protected from all external threats and preserved in its current form, will never become anything more than it already is, will never fulfill its potential for growth, will never produce the fruit or flowers or shade that represent its ultimate purpose and destiny. Only when the seed is released into the dark uncertainty of soil, where it will be broken open, where its current form will be destroyed, where it will be subjected to forces beyond its control, can it begin the process of transformation that will result in life and growth and fruitfulness that far exceed what was possible while it remained safely but unproductively in the gardener's protective grasp. The soil into which spiritual seeds are released through surrender is often dark, uncomfortable, uncertain, and threatening to everything we think we know about who we are, what we need, and how our lives should unfold according to our own understanding of what would be best for us. This soil of surrender includes all the circumstances that we cannot control, all the relationships that refuse to conform to our expectations, all the disappointments that challenge our assumptions about how God should arrange our lives, all the losses that strip away our illusions of self-sufficiency and force us to acknowledge our dependence on grace, mercy, and divine provision that comes to us as gift, rather than as reward for our careful planning and diligent effort to manage outcomes according to our preferences and timeline. Yet it is precisely in this dark soil of surrendered control that the most profound spiritual growth occurs, that the most beautiful expressions of divine grace emerge, that the most powerful demonstrations of God's ability to bring good out of difficulty become visible not only to us, but to others who are watching to see whether faith really makes a difference in how people respond to the inevitable challenges and losses that characterize human existence in a world that is both beautiful and broken, both filled with evidences of divine love and marked by the consequences of human rebellion against divine wisdom and care. The seed that dies to its original form in order to become something greater represents every aspect of human life that must be surrendered in order for spiritual maturity to develop. Our need to control outcomes, our demand for immediate understanding, our insistence that God prove His love by arranging circumstances according to our specifications, our assumption that we know better than divine wisdom what would truly serve our best interests and highest good. The resurrection that follows spiritual death through surrender is not merely the restoration of what existed before, but the emergence of something entirely new, something that could never have developed without the breaking open that initially felt like destruction, something that fulfills purposes and serves needs that were not even visible or understood before the process of surrender transformed the seed from self-contained potential into living, growing fruitful reality that serves not only its own development but provides benefit, beauty, nourishment, and inspiration to others who encounter. The results of what appeared to be loss but was actually the beginning of transformation that exceeded every expectation and surpassed every hope that seemed reasonable. When the seed first entered the dark uncertainty of soil that would become the foundation for new life. The quiet strength of surrender is quiet because it does not need to announce itself, does not require external validation, does not depend on others' recognition or approval to sustain itself. It is strength because it connects human lives to divine resources that are unlimited, divine wisdom that is perfect, divine love that is unconditional, divine power that can accomplish purposes that exceed human imagination and fulfill dreams that surpass human capacity to envision or achieve through individual effort and personal determination. This strength grows in silence, like seeds in soil, like prayers in hearts, like faith in souls that have learned to trust divine gardening even when they cannot see the results, cannot predict the timeline, cannot control the process, but can rest in the character of the one who planted them with purposes too wonderful to be comprehended and too generous to be earned, but freely given to all who are willing to let go of what they can see in order to receive what they have not yet imagined, but what divine love has been preparing for them since before the foundation of the world. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of sand and stone and merciless sun that seemed designed to remind every living creature of its vulnerability, its complete dependence on resources beyond its own capacity to provide, its desperate need for water, shade, and shelter that appeared nowhere within the reach of human vision or human effort to obtain through ordinary means. Here in this place of desolation, where the wealthy and powerful preferred not to venture, where the comfortable and secure avoided traveling, where society's outcasts and forgotten ones found themselves not by choice, but by circumstance, a young woman sat beside a meager well, her dark skin burning under the relentless heat, her heart heavy with the weight of rejection, abandonment, and the kind of invisibility that comes when people look through you rather than at you, when your presence is acknowledged only as an inconvenience, or a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued and cared for and loved. Hagar had entered this wilderness not as an adventurer seeking challenge or a pilgrim pursuing spiritual enlightenment, but as a refugee fleeing the impossible dynamics of a household where she had been caught between competing loyalties, conflicting demands, and circumstances that had transformed her from servant to surrogate mother to scapegoat for tensions that she had not created but for which she was being blamed and punished. Her story, recorded in Genesis 16, represents the experience of every person who has ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Every individual who has discovered that their efforts to survive and provide for their children have led them into situations that feel more like punishment than blessing. Every soul who has wondered if anyone in the universe actually sees their struggle, cares about their pain, or even notices their existence in a world that often seems designed to benefit the privileged while ignoring the needs of those who lack power, connections, and resources to advocate for themselves. As Hagar sat in the wilderness, surrounded by silence that felt more like abandonment than peace, facing uncertainties that threatened not only her own survival, but the life of the child she carried, she encountered something that would change her understanding not only of her immediate circumstances, but of the very nature of divine attention and care. She found herself in the presence of the angel of the Lord, who spoke to her not with condemnation for her situation or judgment about her choices, but with recognition of her identity, acknowledgement of her value, and promises about her future that exceeded anything she could have imagined or dared to hope for in her current state of desperate need and apparent abandonment by both human, society, and divine providence. The conversation, that followed this divine encounter reveals something profound about God's character that often gets obscured by religious emphasis on divine transcendence and omnipotence. That the God who created and sustains the universe is intimately aware of and personally concerned about the individual struggles of people who feel forgotten by society, overlooked by the powerful, and abandoned by those who should have protected and provided for them, but who instead chose their own comfort and convenience over their responsibility to care for the vulnerable ones who had been entrusted to their protection. The angel of the Lord knew Hagar's name, understood her history, saw her current situation with complete clarity, and spoke into her future with promises that demonstrated divine investment in her welfare and the welfare of her descendants that went far beyond temporary rescue from immediate danger to encompass generational blessing that would unfold over centuries of human history. When Hagar responded to this encounter by naming the well Bir Lahai Roy, which means the well of the one who lives and sees me, and declaring that she had seen the one who sees me, she was testifying to a revelation that transforms every experience of feeling invisible, forgotten, or abandoned. The discovery that divine attention is not limited to the famous, the powerful, the religiously significant, or the socially acceptable, but extends with equal intensity and personal care to every individual who has ever felt that their life doesn't matter. Their struggles go unnoticed, their needs are ignored, their pain is irrelevant to anyone who has the power to help or the resources to make a difference in their circumstances. The name El Roy, the God who sees that Hagar gave to the divine presence she encountered, becomes one of the most personally comforting names for God in all of Scripture, speaking directly to the universal human need to be known, recognized, valued, and remembered by someone whose opinion matters more than human judgment, whose care extends beyond human limitations, whose ability to help transcends human resources, whose love persists despite human failures and mistakes and circumstances that might cause other people to write us off as beyond hope or help. This seeing is not passive observation, but active engagement. Not distant awareness, but intimate concern. Not clinical diagnosis, but compassionate understanding that includes not only knowledge of our external circumstances, but deep appreciation for our internal struggles, our fears, our hopes, our dreams, our regrets, and our desperate longing to matter to someone who has the power to make our lives meaningful and significant despite appearances that might suggest otherwise. The God who saw Hagar in her wilderness continues to see every person who finds themselves in their own wilderness seasons. Every single parent struggling to provide for children while feeling abandoned by systems that promised support but delivered disappointment. Every individual battling addiction or mental illness or chronic pain while feeling judged by communities that should offer compassion but instead provide condemnation. Every person whose circumstances have led them to places they never intended to go and never imagined they would have to navigate without adequate resources or reliable support from others who should have remained faithful but chose, instead, to protect their own interests at the expense of those who needed them most. This divine seeing transforms wilderness experiences from evidence of abandonment into opportunities for encounter, from proof of invisibility into demonstrations of how carefully we are observed and how deeply we are valued by the one whose opinion of our worth is not influenced by external circumstances, social status, economic resources, moral performance, or any other human measure of significance and value. The well where Hagar encountered El Roy became a permanent reminder that even in the places where human society refuses to venture, where comfort and security seem impossible to find, where hope appears to be nothing more than naive wishful thinking, divine presence is available, divine care is active, and divine purposes are unfolding in ways that serve not only immediate needs, but eternal purposes that exceed human capacity to understand or appreciate in the moment, but which testify to love that sees, knows, values, and provides for every person who has ever felt lost, forgotten, abandoned, or invisible to those who should have cared enough to notice their need and respond with help rather than judgment, with compassion rather than condemnation, with presence rather than absence, when presence was what was needed most desperately. The pre-dawn darkness hung heavy over the Sea of Galilee as Peter pushed his fishing boat away from the shore. The familiar weight of the nets in his hands, a bitter reminder of how far he felt he had fallen from the glorious days when he had walked beside Jesus. Declaring his unwavering loyalty, promising that he would never abandon his Lord even if all the other disciples fled in fear, boasting that he was ready to go to prison and even to death rather than deny the one he loved more than his own life. Those promises felt like cruel jokes now. Hollow words that mocked him every time he remembered the cock crowing in the courtyard, where he had indeed denied Jesus not once but 3 times. Each denial more emphatic than the last, each lie cutting deeper into his soul as he watched from a distance while the man he had sworn to defend was mocked, beaten, and led away to crucifixion while Peter remained hidden in the shadows, paralyzed by fear and consumed by shame that felt too deep to be forgiven, too complete to be healed, too devastating to be overcome by any amount of regret or repentance or desperate desire to somehow undo what could never be undone. Returning to fishing felt like the only option available to a man who had forfeited his right to be called an apostle, who had proven himself unworthy of the trust that Jesus had placed in him, who had failed at the moment when faithfulness mattered most and now found himself wondering if he had imagined the 3 years of ministry, the miracles he had witnessed, the intimate conversations he had shared with the Son of God, the commission to become a fisher of men that now seemed like someone else's dream, someone else's calling, someone else's destiny that had been mistakenly offered to a man whose courage had evaporated the moment it was truly tested by the kind of pressure that separates authentic faith from merely emotional enthusiasm that cannot sustain itself when following Jesus becomes dangerous rather than exciting, costly rather than rewarding, isolating rather than socially acceptable. John 21:9-19 records what happened on the morning when Peter and several other disciples returned from a night of fruitless fishing to find a figure standing on the shore, someone who called out to them across the water with instructions about where to cast their nets. Someone whose voice carried an authority that seemed familiar, though they could not immediately identify the speaker in the dim light of early morning. When they followed his instructions and found their nets so full of fish that they could barely haul them into the boat, John was the first to recognize the miracle, the first to understand who was speaking to them from the shore, the first to declare with wonder and joy, "It is the Lord." Words that sent Peter diving into the water, swimming frantically toward the beach, desperate to reach Jesus despite his shame, despite his failure, despite his certainty that he deserved rejection rather than welcome, condemnation rather than forgiveness, dismissal rather than restoration. What Peter found when he reached the shore was not the angry confrontation he expected, not the disappointed lecture he deserved, not the formal dismissal from apostleship that his failures seemed to have earned, but something far more unexpected and transformative. Jesus tending a charcoal fire, cooking fish and bread for breakfast, preparing a meal for disciples who had worked all night without success, demonstrating through this simple act of service the same love and care he had shown throughout their years together, the same attention to their practical needs that had characterized his ministry from the beginning, the same gracious hospitality that made room at his table even for those who had abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. The charcoal fire that Jesus had built was particularly significant for Peter, for it was beside a charcoal fire that he had stood in the courtyard when he denied Jesus, and now beside another charcoal fire he would experience restoration that addressed not only his guilt, but his shame, not only his actions, but his identity, not only his past failures, but his future calling. The conversation that followed breakfast revealed the depth of divine grace that operates according to principles that defy human understanding about justice, fairness, and the consequences that should logically follow from serious moral failure and relational betrayal. 3 times Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" Once for each denial, giving him opportunity to affirm his love where he had previously declared his ignorance, to confess his devotion where he had pretended not to know Jesus, to demonstrate the genuineness of his repentance through words that corresponded to the words of denial that had wounded both his own soul and the heart of the one he had claimed to follow, regardless of cost. Each affirmation of love was met not with skeptical questioning about whether Peter could be trusted after his previous failure, not with probationary conditions about proving himself worthy of renewed confidence, but with renewed commission to ministry. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Words that restored not only Peter's relationship with Jesus, but his calling to serve others. His authority to lead the early church, his identity as one chosen and commissioned, and trusted with responsibilities that exceeded his qualifications, and surpassed his worthiness. This scene of restoration beside the Sea of Galilee speaks to every person who has ever felt that their failures have disqualified them from divine love. Divine purpose, divine calling, divine usefulness in serving others and advancing the kingdom of God in the world. Peter's experience demonstrates that grace operates not according to human logic about earning second chances through perfect performance, but according to divine love that sees past our failures to our heart's true desire, that understands the difference between weakness and wickedness, that recognizes authentic repentance and responds with restoration that is more generous than our guilt convinced us was possible, more complete than our shame told us we deserved, more transformative than our regret imagined could ever be experienced by someone who had fallen as far as we had fallen. The breakfast that Jesus prepared for his disciples was more than a meal. It was a sacrament of grace, a communion of forgiveness, a feast of restoration that demonstrated divine love's commitment to relationship that transcends human failure, divine faithfulness that persists despite human unfaithfulness, divine purpose that continues to work through imperfect people rather than waiting for perfect people who would never need grace, never require forgiveness, never experience the depth of divine love that is most fully revealed in the context of restoration after failure, redemption after loss, hope after despair, joy after sorrow, calling after disqualification, commissioning after failure. The Peter who walked away from that breakfast was not the same man who had denied Jesus in the courtyard, not because his personality had been completely transformed or his capacity for failure had been eliminated, but because he had experienced grace that changed his understanding of his identity, his worth, his calling, and his relationship with the God who had chosen him not because he was perfect, but because divine love is perfect, not because he was worthy, but because divine grace makes people worthy. Not because he had earned a second chance, but because divine mercy provides infinite chances for those who are genuinely sorry for their failures and genuinely committed to following Jesus despite their imperfections, limitations, and ongoing susceptibility to the kinds of weakness that had led to their previous failures, but which divine grace can transform into testimonies of restoration that encourage other fallen people to believe that they too can experience forgiveness, renewal, and recommissioning for service that exceeds their qualifications and surpasses their worthiness but perfectly suits divine purposes that are accomplished through broken people who have learned to depend on grace rather than their own strength, wisdom, or moral perfection. The night had been longer than any night in human memory, stretching through hours that felt like years, through darkness that seemed more complete than mere absence of sunlight, through silence that pressed down upon the earth like a weight too heavy to be lifted by any amount of human effort or hope or determination to believe that morning would ever come, that light would ever return, that the sun would ever rise again to restore warmth and visibility, and the ordinary rhythms of life that had been so thoroughly disrupted by events that seemed to prove that darkness was stronger than light, that death was more powerful than life, that evil was more durable than good, that despair was more realistic than hope, that weeping was the only honest response to a world where love could be crucified and justice could be mocked and innocence could be destroyed, while the guilty went free and the powerful prospered and the righteous suffered in silence. Yet somewhere in the depths of this apparently endless night, while those who loved Jesus huddled together in locked rooms, paralyzed by grief and fear and confusion about how their hopes had been so thoroughly shattered, while the disciples struggled to make sense of 3 years that had seemed to promise everything but had apparently delivered nothing but disappointment and loss. While the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee prepared spices and ointments for a burial that would mark the end of dreams that had once seemed so bright and real and achievable, somewhere beyond human sight and understanding, divine purposes were unfolding according to plans that had been established before the foundation of the world. Love was triumphing over hatred. Life was conquering death. Light was preparing to burst forth from darkness with an intensity and glory that would transform not only that particular morning, but every morning that would follow for all who learned to see sunrise as a daily reminder of resurrection. Hope as a reasonable response to temporary darkness. Joy as the inevitable outcome of trusting divine promises, even when external circumstances seem to contradict everything we thought we knew about how love should protect what it values most. Psalm 35 declares with prophetic certainty that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Words that speak to something deeper than the simple observation that difficult times eventually pass, something more profound than the general truth that human emotions are temporary and changeable, something more transformative than the psychological reality that grief naturally gives way to acceptance and eventually to renewed engagement with life's possibilities and opportunities. The morning that David envisioned was not merely the next day on the calendar, but a divine intervention that would break into human history with power and grace sufficient to transform every night season, every period of weeping, every experience of loss and disappointment and suffering into preparation for joy that surpasses human understanding, hope that exceeds human imagination, restoration that transcends human capacity to achieve through individual effort or collective determination. The first Easter morning embodied this promise in ways that exceeded every expectation and shattered every assumption about the permanence of death, the finality of loss, the ultimate triumph of forces that oppose love, justice, mercy, and all the values that make human existence meaningful and worthwhile. The women who approached the tomb carrying burial spices discovered that death had been defeated, that the stone had been rolled away, that the body they had come to anoint was no longer bound by grave clothes, that the one they had loved and followed and watched die was alive with a life that death could not touch, could not diminish, could not threaten, could not overcome, could not even comprehend, because it operated according to principles that transcended natural law and human experience and rational explanation based on observable phenomena and scientific understanding of how the world works according to predictable patterns and immutable laws. The joy that flooded their hearts when they heard the angel announce, "He is not here. He has risen," was not merely relief that their grief had been premature, or happiness that their hopes had been restored, or excitement that their dreams could continue, but something far more radical and transformative. The realization that everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality had been fundamentally altered. That death was not the final word about human existence. That love was more powerful than hatred. That light was stronger than darkness. That good was more durable than evil. That God's promises were more reliable than human disappointment. That divine purposes were more persistent than human opposition. That morning always comes no matter how long and dark and cold and hopeless the night may seem to those who are walking through it without adequate light to see where they are going, or adequate hope to sustain them through the darkness until dawn breaks with glory that transforms everything it touches. This promise of morning joy speaks directly to every person who finds themselves in their own dark night of the soul. Every heart that has been broken by loss that seems too profound to heal, every mind that has been overwhelmed by circumstances that appear too complex to resolve, every spirit that has been crushed by disappointments that feel too devastating to overcome, every life that has been marked by suffering that seems too meaningless to endure without losing faith in the goodness of God, the meaning of existence, the possibility that their pain serves some purpose beyond random cruelty or cosmic indifference. to human welfare and human longing for lives that matter beyond their immediate circumstances and temporary duration on earth. The night seasons of human experience are real and painful, and often prolonged beyond our capacity to understand why. Divine love would allow such extended periods of darkness, such deep experiences of loss, such overwhelming challenges to our faith in the fundamental goodness of existence and the reliability of divine promises about blessing, protection, provision, and care for those who trust in God's character and commit their lives to following divine guidance even when that guidance leads through valleys of shadow and seasons of testing that seem designed to break rather than build, to destroy rather than strengthen, to discourage rather than inspire, to defeat rather than develop the kind of faith that can sustain hope in the midst of circumstances that seem to provide evidence that hope is naive and trust is foolish, and faith is nothing more than wishful thinking that cannot survive contact with the harsh realities of life in a world that often seems hostile to human flourishing and human happiness. Yet the promise remains. Joy comes in the morning. Not because human circumstances naturally improve over time, not because difficulty automatically transforms into ease, not because weeping eventually exhausts itself and gives way to laughter through mere emotional mechanics, but because the God who allows night seasons in human experience is the same God who created the sun to rise each day as a reminder that darkness is temporary. That light is more fundamental to the nature of reality than shadow. That divine love is working even in circumstances that seem to contradict its presence. That divine purposes are being accomplished even through experiences that feel like evidence of divine absence. That divine joy is being prepared even in the midst of circumstances that seem designed to produce nothing but sorrow and disappointment and regret about dreams that will never be fulfilled and hopes that will never be realized and prayers that will never be answered according to human specifications and timeline and understanding of what would constitute adequate evidence of divine love and care. The morning that breaks after long nights of weeping brings not only the end of darkness, but the revelation of what divine love was accomplishing through the darkness. Not only relief from pain, but understanding of how pain served purposes that could not have been achieved through easier circumstances. Not only restoration of hope, but transformation of hope into something more durable than human optimism, more reliable than human determination, more powerful than human effort to manufacture positive outcomes through positive thinking and persistent work toward desired goals and careful management of controllable factors while trusting that uncontrollable factors will somehow cooperate with human plans and preferences and timeline for when improvement should occur and how healing should manifest itself in visible, measurable ways that provide adequate evidence of divine intervention and concern. The disciples had been rowing against contrary winds for hours, their muscles aching from the constant effort required to make any progress across waters that seemed determined to push them back toward the shore they had left. Their hands blistered from gripping the oars so tightly that their knuckles had turned white with the strain of fighting against forces that appeared to be growing stronger rather than weaker as the night wore on. Their hearts beginning to fill with the kind of fear that comes when human strength proves inadequate to overcome natural forces that recognize no human authority, respond to no human pleading, and seem utterly indifferent to human need for safe passage from one place to another across waters that had appeared calm and manageable when they began their journey but had gradually transformed into something that threatened to overwhelm their small boat and leave them at the mercy of waves that could easily claim their lives, despite their years of experience as fishermen who thought they understood the moods and dangers of the Sea of Galilee. Mark 4:35-41 records what happened when the storm reached such intensity that even these experienced sailors began to despair of surviving the night. When the waves began breaking over the sides of their boat, filling it with water faster than they could bail it out, when the wind reached such ferocity that their sails became useless, and their oars could barely keep them from being driven. Onto the rocks that lined the shore they were desperately trying to avoid. When fear overcame their natural confidence and they found themselves crying out for help from the one person in their boat who seemed completely unaffected by the chaos that surrounded them. Jesus, who was sleeping peacefully in the stern, his head resting on a cushion, his breathing deep and regular, his entire demeanor so calm and relaxed that it seemed almost inappropriate given the severity of their situation and the very real possibility that they were all about to perish in waters that cared nothing for their dreams, their families, their ministries, or their plans for the future that would never be fulfilled if this storm continued to rage with such devastating power. The contrast between Jesus' peace and the disciples' panic reveals something profound about the difference between human anxiety in the face of uncontrollable circumstances and divine confidence that rests on knowledge of ultimate outcomes, divine purposes, and divine power that operates according to principles that transcend natural law and human understanding of what is possible within the boundaries of ordinary experience and rational expectation. The disciples' fear was understandable and entirely human. They were facing a genuine threat to their physical survival, encountering forces that exceeded their capacity to manage or overcome through their own skills and experience, confronting the very real possibility that their lives would end not through the gradual aging process they had assumed would characterize their departure from this world, but through sudden, violent destruction that would leave their bodies lost beneath waters that would offer no proper burial, no closure for their families, no completion of the purposes for which they believed they had been called to follow Jesus in the first place. Yet, Jesus slept through the storm not because he was indifferent to their danger or unconcerned about their fear, not because he lacked awareness of the severity of their situation or empathy for their human anxiety about circumstances that genuinely threatened their well-being, but because he understood something about divine sovereignty and divine protection that the disciples had not yet learned. That storms, however powerful they may appear from human perspective, however threatening they may seem to human security, however chaotic they may feel to those who are experiencing them, are not outside the boundaries of divine control, are not evidence of divine abandonment, are not proof that divine love has been withdrawn or that divine purposes have been frustrated by natural forces that operate independently of divine will and divine intention for the lives of those who have committed themselves to following God's guidance, even when that guidance leads through difficult and dangerous circumstances. When the disciples finally woke Jesus with their desperate plea, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" They were expressing more than fear for their physical safety. They were questioning divine love, divine concern, divine awareness of their need, divine willingness to intervene on their behalf when intervention was desperately needed to prevent disaster that would end their ability to serve the kingdom purposes for which they believed they had been called. Their question reveals the universal human tendency to interpret divine silence during crisis as evidence of divine indifference. To assume that God's apparent inaction during times of acute need means that God either doesn't care about our suffering or lacks the power to do anything effective to help us when help is most desperately needed and most urgently requested through prayers that feel like they should receive immediate attention and prompt response from a God who claims to love us and promises to provide for our needs according to his riches in glory. Jesus' response to their cry for help was both immediate and overwhelming in its demonstration of divine authority over natural forces that had seemed completely beyond human control. "Peace, be still," he commanded, speaking to the wind and waves with the same authority he used when healing the sick, casting out demons, and teaching about the kingdom of heaven, treating the storm not as an independent force of nature that might or might not respond to divine intervention, but as a servant that would immediately obey divine command, as a created thing that recognized the voice of its creator and submitted instantly to his will, regardless of how powerful it had appeared to those who were being buffeted by its fury and threatened by its apparent indifference to human welfare and human need for safe passage through dangerous waters. The immediate calm that followed Jesus' command was so complete and sudden that it created a different kind of fear in the disciples' hearts, not the fear of death that had driven them to wake Jesus, but the fear of recognition that they were in the presence of someone whose power exceeded every category of human experience, whose authority extended over realms they had not imagined could be controlled by human speech, whose identity was far more significant than they had previously understood despite their months of traveling with him and witnessing his miracles and listening to his teachings about the kingdom of God. Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him? They asked each other, their question revealing that the storm had served a purpose beyond testing their faith. It had provided an opportunity for them to discover something about Jesus' identity that could only be learned through experiencing his power over circumstances that were completely beyond their own ability to control or influence through human effort or wisdom or determination. The promise embedded in this storm narrative speaks to every person who finds themselves in circumstances that feel overwhelming, uncontrollable, and potentially destructive to everything they value and hope to accomplish in their lives. The promise that divine authority extends over every storm, that divine love is present even when divine intervention is not immediately visible, that divine purposes are being accomplished even through experiences that feel like evidence of divine absence or indifference, that divine peace is available even in the midst of chaos that threatens to overwhelm human capacity to cope with stress, uncertainty, and circumstances that exceed human ability to manage through careful planning and diligent effort and positive thinking and determination to maintain control over outcomes that affect human welfare and human happiness. The calm that Jesus spoke into the storm was not merely the absence of wind and waves, but the presence of divine peace that transcends human understanding. Divine assurance that storms serve divine purposes even when those purposes are not immediately apparent to those who are experiencing the buffeting and the fear and the sense of being at the mercy of forces that seem completely indifferent to human need for security, stability, and predictable circumstances that allow for careful planning and reasonable confidence about the future and the ability to accomplish goals and fulfill dreams and complete the work that gives meaning and purpose to human existence. In a world that often seems designed to frustrate rather than facilitate human flourishing and human joy, the furnace burned with such intensity that the soldiers who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into its flames were themselves killed by the heat that radiated from its opening. Yet these three Hebrew men had walked willingly toward this instrument of execution because they had chosen faithfulness to their God over loyalty to King Nebuchadnezzar, chosen obedience to divine commandments over compliance with royal decrees, chosen integrity over survival, chosen principle over pragmatism, chosen truth over safety, and now they were about to discover whether their God would deliver them from the consequences of that choice, or whether their faithfulness would cost them their lives in a fire that was hot enough to reduce human bodies to ash in minutes, leaving no trace of their existence except the memory of their courage and the testimony of their unwillingness to compromise their convictions, even when compromise would have saved their lives and silence would have preserved their futures, and conformity would have protected their families from the grief of loss and the burden of wondering whether their loved ones had died for nothing more than religious stubbornness that could have been avoided through a simple act of public worship that meant nothing to them personally, but everything to a king whose ego demanded universal submission to his authority and his gods. The events recorded in Daniel chapter 3 reveal something profound about the nature of faith that is tested. by circumstances that threaten not merely comfort or convenience, but life itself. Faith that must choose between preservation of physical existence and preservation of spiritual integrity. Faith that faces the ultimate question of whether divine love is worth dying for when divine deliverance is not guaranteed, when divine protection is not promised, when divine intervention cannot be presumed based on past experiences or theological assumptions about how God should respond to the faithfulness of His people, when that faithfulness is challenged by powers that have the authority to destroy bodies even if they cannot touch souls, to end earthly existence even if they cannot affect eternal destiny, to kill physical life even if they cannot separate believers from the love of God that transcends temporal circumstances and temporal threats and temporal suffering that may be intense, but is also temporary in the context of eternity, where divine justice will ultimately prevail and divine love will ultimately triumph over every form of opposition and persecution and attempt to force God's people to abandon their convictions through threats that seem overwhelming from human perspective. The three Hebrew men's response to Nebuchadnezzar's final ultimatum reveals the kind of mature faith that has moved beyond bargaining with God, beyond conditional commitment that depends on divine deliverance, beyond faith that is contingent upon favorable outcomes, and divine intervention that rescues believers from the consequences of their obedience and protects them from the costs of following divine guidance when that guidance leads through circumstances that threaten human welfare and human security and human plans for long, comfortable, successful lives that unfold according to personal preferences and human understanding of how divine love should manifest itself in the lives of those who trust God and seek to obey His commandments even when obedience is costly, difficult, unpopular, and potentially dangerous to their physical well-being and social standing and economic security, and family relationships and future opportunities for advancement and achievement and the fulfillment of dreams that depend upon survival and freedom and circumstances that allow for the pursuit of personal goals and aspirations. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us from your hand, O King, they declared with confidence in divine power that was matched by resignation to divine will. But if not, let it be known to you, O King, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. These words reveal faith that has been refined by testing, purified by pressure, strengthened by circumstances, that force them to examine the foundations of their commitment and discover that their relationship with God was not based on divine obligation to protect them from suffering, but on divine worthiness to be served regardless of personal cost, divine character that deserved worship regardless of personal benefit, divine truth that commanded allegiance regardless of personal consequences, divine love that was worth dying for, even if dying for it meant never experiencing divine deliverance in this life, never seeing divine vindication in temporal circumstances, never receiving divine reward in earthly terms that could be measured and celebrated and used as evidence to convince others that faith is practical and profitable and beneficial to human welfare and human happiness and human success as defined by worldly standards and worldly values and worldly expectations about how life should unfold for people who make good choices and maintain proper relationships with divine powers that can influence human circumstances. What happened when they were thrown into the furnace? Exceeded every expectation and defied every assumption about the limitations of divine power and divine willingness to intervene in human affairs when human faithfulness is threatened by human evil and human pride and human rebellion against divine authority. King Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fire and saw not 3 men being consumed by flames, but 4 figures walking freely in the midst of the fire. And the 4th looked like the Son of God, suggesting that divine presence had joined them in their suffering. That divine companionship was available even in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy faith. That divine love was willing to enter into human experience of persecution and pain and the kind of testing that threatens to consume everything we value and everything we hope to accomplish and everything we believe about the goodness of God and the meaning of human existence. and the possibility that our faithfulness serves. Purposes that justify the costs we pay to maintain our integrity and our commitment to truth and righteousness and love in a world that often seems to reward compromise and punish conviction and celebrate conformity while persecuting those who dare to live according to principles that transcend human approval and human understanding and human expectations about how religious faith should adapt itself to political realities and social pressures and economic necessities. The fire that was intended to destroy them became the context for a demonstration of divine power that was so dramatic and undeniable that even King Nebuchadnezzar was forced to acknowledge the superiority of their God, the reality of divine protection, and the futility of human attempts to force people to abandon their convictions through threats and intimidation and violence that may be able to destroy bodies but cannot touch the essence of what makes human beings truly human: their capacity for relationship with divine love, their ability to choose truth over falsehood regardless of personal cost, their willingness to maintain integrity even when integrity leads to suffering, their commitment to values that transcend temporal circumstances and temporal pressures and temporal rewards and punishments that may affect the conditions of earthly life but cannot affect the eternal significance of choices made according to divine guidance rather than human calculation of what will produce the most favorable outcomes, according to worldly standards of success and happiness and security. Isaiah 43:2 promises that when you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not scorch you. Words that speak not necessarily to physical protection from literal flames, though such protection is certainly within divine power as demonstrated in the experience of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but to spiritual protection from the kind of spiritual destruction that fire-like circumstances can inflict upon human souls that are not anchored in divine love, not grounded in divine truth, not sustained by divine presence that transforms every form of suffering from evidence of divine abandonment into opportunity for divine encounter, from proof of cosmic indifference into demonstration of divine solidarity with human pain, from meaningless persecution into meaningful participation in the sufferings of Christ, who entered fully into human experience of injustice, persecution, and the kind of suffering that comes to those who refuse to compromise their commitment to truth, love, justice, mercy, and all the values that reflect divine character and divine purposes for human existence and human community and human relationships with one another and with the God who created us for fellowship, for joy, for peace, for love that transcends human limitation and human failure and human tendency to choose security over integrity, comfort over conviction, safety over truth, survival over faithfulness to principles that make life worth living, even when living according to those principles becomes costly, difficult, dangerous, and potentially fatal according to human calculation, but eternally significant according to divine evaluation of what matters most in the context of purposes that extend far beyond temporal circumstances, and temporal outcomes and temporal rewards that may be meaningful in the short term but pale in comparison to eternal rewards that await those who choose faithfulness over safety, integrity over survival, divine approval over human approval, divine love over human security, divine purposes over human plans, divine will over human preferences, divine glory over human comfort and convenience, and the kind of easy life that avoids testing, avoids challenge, avoids the opportunity to discover whether faith is strong enough to survive fire and whether divine love is present enough to provide companionship even in circumstances that seem designed to prove that we are alone, abandoned, forgotten, and left to face the consequences of our convictions without divine help, divine presence or divine intervention to rescue us from the costs of following, divine guidance when that guidance leads through valleys of shadow and furnaces of testing that reveal the true nature of our relationship with God and the true strength of our commitment to truth that transcends human understanding and human approval and human support. The ruins, stretched as far as the eye could see, blackened timbers and crumbled walls marking the places where homes had once stood, where families had gathered around dinner tables, where children had played in gardens that were now nothing more than patches of ash-covered earth. where dreams had been nurtured and plans had been made, and hopes had flourished until the day when destruction came not as a distant possibility, but as an immediate reality that consumed everything in its path, leaving behind only the kind of desolation that makes people wonder if restoration is possible, if rebuilding is worth the effort, if hope is anything more than naive optimism in the face of losses that feel too complete to be overcome, too devastating to be healed, too final to be reversed by any amount of human determination or divine intervention that might transform ash into something beautiful, might create new life from the remnants of what appeared to be total destruction, might demonstrate that divine love is more powerful than human capacity for destruction, divine creativity more persistent than human ability to destroy, divine purposes more durable than human plans that can be reduced to nothing in a single day of calamity. Yet somewhere in the midst of this landscape of loss, a woman knelt beside what had once been her rose garden, her hands black with soot as she carefully cleared away the debris that covered the ground, searching for any sign that roots had survived the fire that had consumed everything above ground. Any evidence that life persisted beneath the surface, even when surface appearances suggested that death had claimed complete victory. Any indication that the beauty she had cultivated over years of patient tending might have the resilience to emerge again from soil that had been enriched by the very ashes of its own apparent destruction. Her actions represented more than gardening. They represented faith that refuses to accept the finality of loss, hope that continues to believe in the possibility of restoration, even when restoration seems impossible according to human logic and human experience and human understanding of how completely destruction can eliminate not only what exists, but what might exist in the future if given opportunity to grow and develop and flourish according to divine purposes that use even devastation as preparation for demonstrations of creative power that exceed human imagination and surpass human ability to predict or control or fully comprehend. This scene of searching for life in the midst of destruction embodies the promise that God spoke through the prophet Isaiah in chapter 61, verse 3, where he declares his intention to give his people a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of the spirit of despair. Words that speak to divine ability to transform the most devastating losses into the foundations for the most glorious restorations, the most complete defeats into the starting points for the most triumphant victories, the most hopeless circumstances into the raw materials for the most beautiful demonstrations of divine power, divine love, divine creativity, and divine faithfulness, to promises that seem impossible when measured against human ability to fulfill commitments, human capacity to restore what has been damaged, human power to bring good out of circumstances that appear to be completely evil, completely destructive, completely opposed to everything that makes life meaningful and beautiful and worth celebrating. The ashes that cover the landscape of human experience after seasons of loss and disappointment and destruction are real and painful, and represent genuine devastation that cannot be minimized or dismissed or explained away by religious platitudes that fail to acknowledge the depth of human suffering, the extent of human loss, the reality of human pain that comes when circumstances destroy not only our external possessions and achievements, but our internal sense of meaning, purpose, identity, and hope for the future. These ashes include the remains of relationships that have been destroyed by betrayal, misunderstanding, conflict, or death that separates people who loved each other and planned to spend their lives together, building something beautiful and lasting and significant that would testify to the power of human love and human commitment, and human ability to create meaning and purpose and joy in the midst of a world that often seems designed to frustrate rather than facilitate human happiness and human flourishing and human success in achieving the dreams and goals and aspirations that give shape and direction to human existence. The ashes also include the remnants of careers that have been destroyed by economic downturns, personal failures, health crises, or circumstances beyond human control that eliminate years of careful preparation, patient investment, gradual advancement, and the kind of professional development that was supposed to provide not only financial security, but personal satisfaction and social contribution, and the sense of accomplishment that comes from using individual gifts and talents and abilities in ways that serve both personal fulfillment and community benefit and divine purposes, that give ultimate meaning to human work and human achievement and human attempts to make positive differences in the world through dedicated effort and faithful service and commitment to excellence that honors both human potential and divine. Creativity that is expressed through human hands and human minds and human hearts that have been created in the image of God and equipped with capabilities that reflect divine character and divine purposes for human existence and human community. Yet, the promise of beauty from ashes speaks to divine ability to use these very losses as the foundation for restoration that exceeds what existed before the destruction, that creates possibilities that were not available before the devastation, that opens doors that were not visible before the circumstances, that seem to close every door and eliminate every opportunity and destroy every hope for a future that could be better than the past, more meaningful than the present, more beautiful than anything that human imagination could conceive or human effort could achieve through the kind of careful planning and diligent work that assumes that human wisdom is adequate to direct human lives and human power is sufficient to achieve human goals, and human love is strong enough to protect what humans value most highly and work most diligently to preserve, maintain, and develop over time through patience and persistence, and the kind of commitment that believes in the possibility of building something lasting and significant and beautiful in a world that is both temporary and eternal, both fragile and resilient, both vulnerable to destruction and capable of restoration, that testifies to power and love and creativity that transcend human limitation and human failure and human inability to control outcomes or guarantee that investments of time and energy and love will produce the results that were hoped for and planned for and worked toward with such dedication and sacrifice. The woman who searched through the ashes of her garden was not engaging in mere wishful thinking or denial of reality or naive optimism that refused to acknowledge the extent of her loss. She was acting on faith that understood something about the nature of life, the power of roots, the resilience of beauty, and the divine capacity to bring forth from destruction something more glorious than what had been destroyed, something more beautiful than what had been lost, something more meaningful than what had been reduced to ashes that appeared to represent the end of everything she had loved and tended and hoped would flourish for years to come, providing beauty and fragrance and joy not only for herself, but for everyone who encountered the results of her patient cultivation and careful attention to the details that transform ordinary soil into extraordinary displays of divine creativity. Working through human partnership with natural processes that reflect supernatural purposes and supernatural love for beauty that serves no practical purpose except to testify to the character of the one who creates and sustains and restores. Life in forms that exceed necessity and demonstrate love that goes beyond utility to embrace beauty for its own sake, joy for its own value, hope for its own power to transform human hearts and human communities, and human understanding of what is possible when divine love meets human faith in circumstances that seem designed to destroy faith, eliminate hope, and convince people that beauty is too fragile to survive in a world where destruction often seems more powerful than creation, death more final than life, ending more certain than beginning, loss more common than discovery, disappointment more frequent than fulfillment, sorrow more familiar than joy. Yet when spring came to the ash-covered ground where the woman had been searching and clearing and preparing and hoping and trusting that divine promises about beauty from ashes were more reliable than human experience, of how completely destruction can eliminate every sign of life and every reason for hope. Green shoots began to emerge from soil that had been enriched by the very ashes of its own apparent destruction, and the roses that bloomed that year were more beautiful, more fragrant, more abundant than any that had grown in that garden before the fire had reduced everything to ash, demonstrating that divine purposes can use even destruction as preparation for creation that exceeds human imagination and surpasses human ability to predict or control, but which testifies to love that is stronger than death, creativity that is more powerful than destruction, hope that is more durable than disappointment, joy that is more lasting than sorrow, beauty that is more resilient than chaos, life that is more persistent than any force that opposes it, and divine faithfulness that keeps every promise even. When keeping promises requires miracles that transform ashes into beauty, mourning into joy, despair into hope, endings into beginnings, loss into discovery, destruction into creation, death into life, human impossibility into divine possibility, human limitation into divine power, human failure into divine success, human endings into divine beginnings that exceed every expectation and surpass every dream and fulfill every hope and restore every loss in ways that demonstrate divine love, divine creativity, divine power, and divine faithfulness to purposes that use even human failure and human loss and human suffering as raw materials for demonstrations of grace that transform lives, heal hearts, restore hope, renew joy, and create beauty that testifies to divine character and divine love for people who have learned to trust divine promises, even when trusting those promises requires faith that goes beyond human understanding and human experience and human ability to predict outcomes based on observable evidence and rational calculation of what seems possible within the boundaries of natural law and human capability and human wisdom about how to achieve desired results through careful planning and diligent effort and the kind of human determination that assumes human resources are adequate to accomplish human purposes and fulfill human dreams and create human meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to human aspirations and human hopes and human need for lives that matter beyond their immediate circumstances and temporal duration. The sunrise painted the eastern sky with colors that seemed too beautiful to be real, too vibrant to be natural, too glorious to be anything other than divine artistry, celebrating a new day, a new beginning, a new chapter in the story of a soul that had walked through valleys of shadow and emerged into light that was not merely the absence of darkness, but the presence of illumination that transformed everything it touched, revealing beauty that had been hidden by night, possibilities that had been obscured by circumstances, hope that had been buried beneath layers of disappointment and despair and confusion about whether divine love was real and whether divine purposes were worthy of human trust, and whether divine promises were reliable enough to stake an entire life upon them, even when staking a life upon divine promises required abandoning human strategies for security, success, and the kind of happiness that depends upon controlling circumstances rather than trusting the one who controls circumstances according to wisdom that exceeds human understanding and love that surpasses human comprehension and purposes that transcend human imagination and human ability to predict what divine intervention will look like when it finally arrives in human experience that has been marked by waiting, wondering, hoping, doubting, trusting, and learning to recognize divine presence in forms that defy human expectations about how God should manifest his care for people who have committed their lives to following his guidance, even when that guidance leads through territories that feel more like exile than pilgrimage, more like punishment than blessing, more like evidence of divine displeasure than divine love. Sarah stood at her kitchen window watching the dawn break over the neighborhood where she had lived for 15 years. The same houses and trees and streets that had witnessed her journey through the darkest season of her life. The months when her daughter's illness had consumed every waking moment, every prayer, Every hope, every conversation with friends who had eventually grown tired of her anxiety and fear and desperate need for reassurance that things would somehow work out, that God would somehow intervene, that medical treatment would somehow succeed where earlier treatments had failed, that faith would somehow prove to be more than wishful thinking disguised as religious conviction, that divine love would somehow demonstrate itself through circumstances that seemed to provide evidence that either God didn't exist, or God didn't care, or God was powerless to help, or God was testing her beyond her capacity to endure the test without losing her mind. Her faith, her ability to function as wife and mother and friend and member of a community that expected her to maintain some semblance of normalcy while her world was falling apart and her assumptions about how life should work were being systematically destroyed by reality that refused to conform to her expectations. Her prayers, her desperate attempts to bargain with divine authority that seemed increasingly distant and unresponsive to her pleas for mercy, healing, intervention, and some sign that her family had not been forgotten by the one who was supposed to care about every sparrow that falls, and every hair on every human head, and every tear that falls from eyes that have grown tired of crying. The woman who stood at that window was not the same person who had knelt in the church pew 18 months earlier, crushed by the weight of circumstances that felt too heavy to bear, too complex to understand, too frightening to face without some assurance that divine love was real, and divine power was available, and divine purposes were good enough to justify the costs that seemed to be required for participation in those purposes, costs that included not only her daughter's suffering, but her own spiritual crisis, her husband's struggle with anger and helplessness, her son's confusion about why prayer didn't seem to work the way Sunday school had taught him to expect, her parents' well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice about faith and healing and divine will and human responsibility, and the proper response to circumstances that seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew about God's character and God's promises and God's relationship with people who trust Him and seek to obey His guidance and live according to principles that are supposed to result in blessing rather than suffering, protection rather than vulnerability, answered prayers rather than silence that stretches on indefinitely, while hope gradually transforms into resignation, and resignation gradually transforms into bitterness, and bitterness gradually transforms into the kind of spiritual numbness that allows people to go through the motions of faith without actually believing that faith makes any practical difference in how life unfolds for those who practice it consistently and sincerely, and with the kind of commitment that sacrifices personal convenience and comfort for the sake of principles that are supposed to be more valuable than temporary pleasure and more reliable than human strategies for achieving security and happiness through careful planning and diligent effort, and the kind of moral behavior that ought to earn divine approval and divine protection and divine blessing that is visible in external circumstances rather than hidden in internal transformation that may be real, but is not obvious to observers who judge the effectiveness of faith by its ability to produce favorable outcomes rather than its capacity to sustain hope in unfavorable circumstances, peace in chaotic situations, joy in sorrowful seasons, and love in relationships that are strained by the kind of testing that reveals the true nature of human commitment and human character and human capacity for growth that can only occur through experiences that stretch souls beyond their comfort zones and force them to discover resources they didn't know they possessed and develop strength they didn't know they needed and learn lessons they didn't want to learn about the nature of divine love, divine wisdom, divine timing, and divine purposes that use even suffering as curriculum in the school of spiritual maturity that prepares students for forms of service and expressions of love and demonstrations of faith that would not be possible without graduation from courses that are painful but necessary for the kind of character development that enables human beings to represent divine character in a world that desperately needs to see authentic examples of what it looks like to trust divine love when trusting divine love requires faith that goes beyond rational explanation and human understanding, and observable evidence that would convince skeptical observers that faith is practical and profitable and beneficial to human welfare according to standards that can be measured and evaluated and compared with alternative approaches to achieving security, happiness, and the kind of meaningful existence that justifies the effort required to maintain hope in circumstances that seem designed to destroy hope rather than nurture it, to discourage faith rather than develop it, to isolate souls rather than connect them to divine love and divine community and divine purposes that give meaning to individual suffering and transform personal pain into preparation for ministry that can comfort others who are walking through similar valleys and facing similar questions and needing similar assurance that their struggles are not evidence of divine abandonment, but opportunities for divine encounter that will ultimately result in spiritual growth, increased faith, deeper compassion, and the kind of wisdom that can only be acquired through experience that tests every assumption and challenges every preconception and forces people to examine the foundations of their beliefs and discover whether those foundations are strong enough to support them when external supports are removed and internal resources are exhausted, and the only thing left is faith that continues to trust divine love, even when that love is expressed in ways that defy human expectations and challenge human assumptions about how love should manifest itself in the lives of people who are beloved. Her daughter's recovery had not come through dramatic miracle or sudden healing that would have provided the kind of testimony that impresses skeptics and convinces doubters and validates faith in ways that are obvious to everyone who observes the results. But through gradual improvement that included setbacks and disappointments and periods when progress seemed to reverse itself and hope seemed naive and medical treatment seemed inadequate and prayer seemed ineffective and the future seemed uncertain and frightening and impossible to navigate without more information, more assurance, more evidence that divine intervention was actually occurring, rather than merely being hoped for by people who had invested so much in the belief that God cares about human suffering that they could not afford to acknowledge the possibility that their faith was misplaced. Their prayers were unheard, their hopes were unrealistic, and their situation was simply one of many tragedies that occur in a world where random events sometimes destroy lives and dreams and plans and futures without regard for human virtue, or faith or prayer, or any other factor that religious people assume should provide protection from the kind of losses that seem meaningless, unfair, and incompatible with belief in divine love that is both powerful enough to intervene and caring enough to want to intervene when intervention would prevent suffering, restore health, protect families, and demonstrate divine power in ways that would strengthen faith, encourage hope, and provide evidence that religious commitment serves practical purposes rather than merely psychological ones that may make people feel better about circumstances they cannot control, but do not actually change those circumstances, in ways that are visible to outside observers who judge the effectiveness of faith by its results rather than its process, its outcomes rather than its transformative effect on human character and human capacity for love and human ability to find meaning and purpose in circumstances that appear to be meaningless and purposeless according to standards that measure value in terms of immediate gratification, observable success, and the absence of suffering, rather than the presence of growth that may be painful but is ultimately beneficial for reasons that are not immediately apparent but become clear over time as people discover that their most difficult experiences have prepared them for their most meaningful contributions to human welfare and divine purposes in the world. The light that now illuminated Sarah's understanding was not merely intellectual enlightenment or psychological recovery or emotional healing, though it certainly included all of these dimensions of restoration. It was spiritual illumination that had transformed her relationship not only with her circumstances, but with the God who had been present throughout her journey, even when his presence was not immediately recognizable, even when his purposes were not immediately understandable, even when his love was not immediately apparent in the external events that had dominated her attention and consumed her emotional energy and challenged her assumptions about how divine care should manifest itself in the lives of people who trust God and seek to live according to divine guidance and biblical principles that are supposed to result in blessing rather than testing, protection rather than vulnerability, clear answers rather than complicated questions that require more faith than she had thought she possessed and more trust than she had believed was reasonable to place in divine promises that seemed too good to be true when life was easy, and too distant to be relevant when life became difficult and complicated and painful in ways that made her question everything she had been taught about God's character, God's promises, God's relationship with human beings, and God's involvement in human affairs that often seem to unfold according to natural processes and human choices and random events rather than divine intervention that demonstrates supernatural care for people who are supposedly beloved, but who often feel abandoned, forgotten, overlooked, and left to face their challenges without adequate resources or clear guidance or obvious evidence that their struggles serve any purpose beyond testing their capacity to endure pain without losing their sanity, their relationships, their ability to function in society, or their willingness to continue believing that life has meaning, even when that meaning is not immediately apparent and may never become clear during their earthly existence, but may only be revealed in eternity, when divine purposes are fully displayed and human understanding is perfected and every question is answered and every tear is wiped away and every form of suffering is transformed into testimony of divine love that was working all things together for good, even when the definition of good exceeded human understanding and human experience and human ability to recognize or appreciate during the process of transformation that was painful, difficult, confusing, and apparently endless, but was actually preparation for joy that would exceed every expectation and surpass every dream and fulfill every hope in ways that would demonstrate divine faithfulness to promises that seemed impossible. When circumstances suggested that divine love was either absent or powerless, or expressed in ways that were indistinguishable from divine indifference to human welfare and human happiness and human need for lives that matter beyond their immediate circumstances and temporal duration in a world that is both beautiful and broken, both filled with evidence of divine creativity and marked by the consequences of human rebellion against divine authority and divine wisdom and divine love that seeks human welfare, but respects human freedom even when human freedom is used in ways that create suffering for individuals and families and communities and nations that suffer the consequences of choices made by people who prefer human wisdom to divine guidance, human strategies to divine purposes, human understanding to divine revelation, human timing to divine timing, and human solutions to divine intervention that may require more patience and more faith and more trust than human nature finds comfortable, or reasonable or practical according to standards that measure effectiveness by immediate results rather than long-term transformation, temporary relief rather than permanent restoration, surface changes rather than deep healing that addresses root causes rather than merely treating symptoms of spiritual, emotional, physical, and relational brokenness that characterizes human existence in a fallen world where divine purposes are being accomplished through processes that often appear to human observation to be evidence of divine absence rather than divine presence, divine indifference rather than divine love, divine powerlessness rather than divine sovereignty that operates according to wisdom that exceeds human understanding and love that surpasses human comprehension and purposes that transcend human imagination and human ability to predict or control or fully appreciate during the process of their unfolding in individual lives and human history, and the cosmic story of redemption that includes every form of human suffering as raw material, for demonstrations of divine grace that transform pain into purpose, loss into gain, endings into beginnings, death into life, and human impossibility into divine possibility that exceeds every expectation and surpasses every dream and fulfills every hope that has been deferred but not denied, delayed but not destroyed, hidden but not lost, refined but not eliminated, tested but not abandoned by divine love that is more persistent than human ability to resist it, more patient than human ability to exhaust it, more creative than human ability to limit it, and more powerful than human ability to defeat it through unbelief, rebellion, pride, or any other form of opposition to divine purposes that use even human opposition as material for demonstrations of grace that overcome evil with good, hatred with love, despair with hope, and death with life that testifies, to divine character and divine power and divine faithfulness, to promises that are more reliable than human ability to understand them, more durable than human ability to test them, and more generous than human ability to deserve them, but which are freely given to all who are willing to receive them as gifts rather than trying to earn them as wages. Embrace them as grace rather than demanding them as rights. Trust them as expressions of divine love rather than questioning them as evidence of divine obligation to arrange human circumstances, according to human preferences and human understanding of what would constitute adequate proof of divine care and divine power and divine presence in human lives that are loved beyond human comprehension and valued beyond human imagination and held by divine love that will never let them go regardless of circumstances that may seem to suggest otherwise, experiences that may appear to contradict divine promises, or seasons of testing that challenge every assumption about divine character and divine purposes, but which ultimately serve to refine faith, deepen trust, increase love, develop character, and prepare souls for forms of service and expressions of joy and demonstrations of divine grace that would not be possible without graduation from the curriculum of suffering that is painful but necessary for spiritual maturity that enables human beings to represent divine character in a world that desperately needs to see authentic examples of what it looks like to walk in divine light that illuminates not only the path forward but the purpose behind every step, the meaning within every struggle, the hope beneath every disappointment, and the love surrounding every circumstance that seems designed to discourage rather than encourage, to defeat rather than develop, to destroy rather than build, to isolate rather than connect people to divine purposes and divine community and divine love that transforms every aspect of human existence from burden to blessing, from trial to triumph, from ending to beginning, from loss to gain, from death to life, and from human limitation to divine possibility, that exceeds every expectation and surpasses every dream and fulfills every hope that has been planted in human hearts by divine love that created those hearts for relationship, for joy, for peace, for love, and for the kind of abundant life that reflects divine character and serves divine purposes and testifies to divine grace that is available to all who are willing to receive it by faith rather than trying to earn it by works. Embrace it as gift rather than demanding it as payment, and trust it as expression of divine love rather than questioning it as evidence of divine obligation to provide human beings with the kind of lives they think they deserve based on their moral performance, religious devotion, faithful service, or any other human qualification. That might seem to create divine debt rather than human dependence on divine grace that is freely given to all who acknowledge their need for it and are willing to receive it on divine terms, rather than trying to negotiate human terms that would make divine love conditional upon human worthiness, divine blessing dependent upon human achievement, divine presence contingent upon human perfection, and divine purposes subordinate to human preferences about how divine love should manifest itself in human circumstances that are loved by God, regardless of how difficult they may be for humans to understand, accept, or appreciate as expressions of divine care that operates according to wisdom that exceeds human understanding, love that surpasses human comprehension, and purposes that transcend human imagination but which ultimately serve human welfare in ways that exceed human ability to predict, control, or fully appreciate during the process of their unfolding, but which will ultimately be revealed as expressions of divine love that could not have been accomplished through easier circumstances, through human planning, through human effort, or through any approach to human welfare that depends upon human wisdom rather than divine guidance, human power rather than divine strength, human love rather than divine grace, or human purposes rather than divine will that seeks human happiness, but defines happiness in terms of spiritual maturity, eternal significance, and relationship with divine love rather than temporal comfort, material prosperity, physical health, or any other good thing that may be included in divine blessing, but which does not constitute the essence of divine love that values human souls more than human circumstances, human character more than human comfort, human relationship with God more than human success according to worldly standards,